I am Byron, 70 years old, and I recently learned that the blood in your veins does not guarantee loyalty. My son and his wife cut me off for 15 years. They never allowed me to see my grandchildren. Then they discovered I had purchased a massive estate. The next morning, they showed up unannounced on my property. My son looked me right in the eye and told me they were moving in because I had far too many empty rooms. What I did in response completely shattered their arrogant reality. Before I continue my story, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to defend your dignity against a family member. The grinding roar of heavy diesel engines shattered the peaceful quiet of my Thursday morning. I stepped out onto the wide wraparound front porch of my home, a fresh cup of coffee trembling slightly in my hand. Two massive, pristine, white moving trucks had parked directly on my manicured circular driveway. The heavy tires crushed the edge of the landscaping I had personally cultivated. I stood perfectly still, watching the air brakes hiss and release with a deafening screech. A sleek luxury SUV pulled up behind the second truck. The passenger door opened first. Audrey stepped out. She wore oversized designer sunglasses and a beige silk pantsuit that looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of my quiet, unassuming neighborhood. Then the driver's side door opened. Tyson stepped onto the pavement. I had not spoken to my son since 2011. 15 years of absolute silence evaporated in a matter of seconds. I felt my chest tighten, but I forced my breathing to remain steady. Tyson did not wave. He did not walk toward me to offer a greeting or an apology for a decade and a half of absence. Instead, he turned his back to me completely. He raised his arm, pointing directly at the towering stone facade of my $4 million estate. He clapped his hands loudly to get the attention of the moving crew. He shouted a sharp order across the lawn, instructing the men to open the cargo doors and begin unloading immediately. I placed my coffee mug on the wooden railing, descended the porch stairs with my jaw locked tight, and walked straight toward the man who used to be my son. The lead mover, a burly man carrying a metal clipboard, approached Tyson for directions. Tyson pointed confidently toward the grand double doors of my house. He commanded the mover to carry all the heavy, expensive modern bedroom furniture straight up the main staircase and place it directly into the master suite. I stepped between Tyson and the mover, my presence forcing the worker to stop in his tracks. I looked directly at Tyson. My voice was calm, holding absolutely no trace of the shock currently racing through my veins. I clearly stated that this was my house and no one was moving anything across my threshold. Audrey walked up to stand beside her husband. She removed her oversized sunglasses, offering me a cold, patronizing smile that I remembered vividly from 15 years ago. She crossed her arms and looked at the expansive stone facade of my home. She told me to lower my voice. She confidently stated that she and Tyson had read all about my recent real estate acquisition in a prominent local business journal. It was true. I had quietly sold the regional logistics company I built from the ground up over 40 years. The sale had finalized a year prior, providing me with the immense capital to buy this 10,000 square foot property outright. I wanted a quiet place to reflect and enjoy the fruits of my lifelong labor after losing my beloved wife, Clarice. Audrey stepped closer, invading my personal space. She looked me up and down with blatant disgust. She loudly declared that a 70-year-old man living completely alone in a 10,000 square foot mansion was a selfish waste of space. She argued that family should share their good fortune conveniently, ignoring the fact that she was the one who demanded Tyson cut all ties with me. She spoke to me not as a father-in-law, but as an obstacle she intended to bulldoze. Tyson stood there, nodding in agreement with every venomous word his wife delivered. He looked at the massive house, his eyes wide with an unearned sense of entitlement. He believed my hard work was simply an inheritance waiting to be claimed. He turned to the movers, waving his hand dismissively, and told them to ignore me and proceed with the unloading. The sheer audacity of their arrival struck me like a physical blow. They truly believed they could simply march into my sanctuary and claim it as their own territory. I swiftly bypassed them both and planted my feet squarely in front of the heavy wooden double doors of my home. I folded my arms across my chest, forming a rigid physical barrier. I stared at the movers, silently daring any of them to take another step onto my property. The workers hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating family dispute unfolding right in front of them on the driveway. Tyson's arrogant smirk vanished, his face flushed with sudden anger. He marched up the steps, stepping dangerously close to my face. He was taller than me now, and he used his physical size to attempt to completely intimidate me. He leaned down his face inches from mine and lowered his voice into a vicious, threatening whisper. He aggressively pointed his finger toward the tinted windows of the luxury SUV idling on the driveway. Through the dark glass, I could barely make out the silhouettes of two young boys sitting quietly in the back seat. My twin grandsons. I had never even met them in person. Tyson stated that his family had absolutely nowhere else to go. His voice dripped with malicious intent as he laid out his ultimatum. He threatened to call the local police right then and there. He promised to claim that I had explicitly invited them to live with me, only to violently lock them out in the cold when they arrived. He swore he would drag those two innocent little boys out of the vehicle and force them to watch me get arrested. He threatened to create a highly public, traumatizing spectacle that would humiliate me in my new prestigious neighborhood and ruin my reputation forever. I looked closely at the SUV. My heart ached profoundly at the thought of those children. Clarice and I had always dreamed of filling a home with the sound of our grandchildren laughing. She had passed away never knowing the joy of holding them in her arms. I knew Tyson was entirely serious. He possessed the exact same reckless, destructive energy that had forced me to distance myself from him all those years ago. He was willing to use his own children as collateral damage just to secure a roof over his head. I weighed my options in a fraction of a second. A public police confrontation would undoubtedly terrify the boys. It would permanently scar their very first memory of their grandfather with flashing lights and shouting. I adamantly refused to be the source of their trauma. I realized that keeping them completely safe meant purposefully losing this initial skirmish. I chose absolute silence. I maintained my intense gaze on Tyson for one long, heavy moment, memorizing the profound disrespect burning in his eyes. Then I slowly stepped aside, clearing the path to my front door. Tyson sneered, adjusting his suit jacket as if he had just won a major victory. He aggressively signaled the movers to proceed. Audrey marched past me without a single word of gratitude, acting as though she owned the very air she breathed. The heavy oak doors swung open. The invasion of my hard-earned sanctuary had officially begun. They mistook my tactical retreat for surrender, completely unaware of the silent adjustment I was already planning to execute. By evening, the sanctuary I had carefully built felt like a commercial warehouse belonging to hostile strangers. Heavy cardboard boxes sealed tight with loud packing tape completely blocked the wide, polished hallways of the main floor. The quiet elegance of my home was buried under towering stacks of imported designer luggage and oversized crates marked with bright, fragile stickers. I navigated through my own living room as if I were a trespasser walking through a dangerous minefield. The soft ambient lighting I usually preferred was completely overpowered by the harsh, glaring overhead chandeliers Audrey had switched on the absolute moment she walked through the front door. I turned the corner toward the private den, the specific room where I kept my most treasured personal possessions. A sharp, violent rustling sound stopped me dead in my tracks. I stepped into the doorway and felt the breath leave my lungs entirely. Audrey stood right in the center of the room, holding a thick, black, industrial trash bag. She was systematically stripping the room of its soul. I watched in absolute horror as she grabbed a hand-stitched quilt from the back of my leather reading chair. It was a beautiful patchwork of deep reds, vibrant blues, and warm golds carefully assembled over many months by my late wife, Clarice. Audrey balled the delicate fabric up without a single second glance and shoved it directly down into the garbage. She then turned her immediate attention to the custom oak shelving unit against the far wall. Her manicured hands grabbed a thick stack of vintage vinyl records. These were original pressings of Marvin Gaye, Al Green, and Aretha Franklin. She dropped them callously into the plastic bag. The heavy cardboard sleeves slammed aggressively against each other, emitting a sickening crunch that echoed loudly in the otherwise silent room. I loudly demanded to know exactly what she thought she was doing. She did not even flinch. She slowly turned around, smoothing out her expensive silk blouse, and offered me a look of pure, unadulterated annoyance. She dismissively gestured to the empty spaces on the oak shelves. She confidently declared that my house was suffocating and severely outdated for their needs. She stated that her high-end interior designer was arriving the following week to implement a strict minimalist aesthetic throughout the entire property. According to her cold logic, the house desperately needed to reflect a modern, elevated social status, and the old items I hoarded were nothing more than a breeding ground for dust and allergens. She spoke to me exactly as if she were a wealthy property manager explaining a mandatory renovation to a confused, helpless tenant. She confidently reached for another stack of classic records. I did not give her the opportunity to touch a single album more. I stepped forward rapidly, crossing the large room in 2 long strides, and snatched the heavy black trash bag directly out of her hands. The sudden forceful movement caught her completely off guard. She stumbled back a half step, her eyes widening in momentary shock before hardening into icy, venomous slits. I pulled the hand-stitched quilt from the plastic opening, fiercely clutching the familiar comforting fabric to my chest. I stared at her, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that commanded absolute attention. I told her she had absolutely no right to touch anything inside this room. I forced her to stand there and listen to the sacred history she was so casually throwing away. I explicitly explained that when Clarice and I first married, we had absolutely nothing to our names. I worked grueling, bone-chilling double shifts at the commercial shipping yard down on the waterfront. I spent 12 hours a day hauling heavy steel crates until my hands bled profusely and my back seized, just to keep the heat running in our tiny, drafty apartment. I saved single-dollar bills in a hidden glass jar for months on end. Every single one of those vinyl records was purchased with money I bled for, bought solely to see Clarice smile after a long, exhausting week of struggle. That quilt was meticulously constructed from the worn scraps of our old work clothes, serving as a tangible map of our survival and our enduring love. Audrey let out a loud, theatrical sigh. She dramatically rolled her eyes, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. She looked at me, not with an ounce of understanding, but with clinical, calculating disdain. She flatly stated that Clarice was dead and living in a dusty shrine to the past was exceptionally pathetic. She took a deliberate step closer, lowering her voice to a patronizing, mocking whisper. She told me that irrationally clinging to useless junk and reacting with such explosive, unprovoked aggression were classic, well-documented signs of early cognitive decline. She falsely claimed my mind was clearly failing me. She was entirely weaponizing my deep grief against me. She was deliberately laying the psychological groundwork to completely strip me of my autonomy, painting me as a fragile, unstable old man who was entirely incapable of managing his own environment. Before I could respond to her vicious, calculated accusation, heavy footsteps echoed loudly down the hardwood hallway. Tyson marched into the den, drawn by the sound of the tense confrontation. He took one quick look at the scene and immediately positioned himself as the aggressive protector of his wife. He did not ask what had happened. He did not ask why I was defensively clutching his own mother's beloved belongings to my chest. He looked at the black trash bag on the floor, then at me, and his face contorted with aggressive, manufactured indignation. He loudly demanded to know why I was screaming at Audrey. I calmly stated the absolute truth, explaining that she was actively destroying Clarice's irreplaceable possessions. Tyson dismissed my words entirely. He stepped directly into my personal space, aggressively puffing out his chest to emphasize his physical size. He aggressively pointed his finger directly at my face and told me that my behavior was becoming completely unhinged. He loudly declared that I was losing my grip on reality over literal garbage. He falsely claimed that my supposed mental instability was exactly why I could no longer be trusted to manage the daily operations of the large estate. He held out his open palm and forcefully demanded I hand over the master keys to the property immediately. He stated that for the ultimate safety of his family, he needed to assume full control of the house. I looked deep into the eyes of the boy I had raised. The boy who used to fall asleep peacefully, listening to the very records he was now allowing his wife to discard like trash. I saw a man consumed by blinding greed, desperate to assert total dominance. Every muscle in my body tensed with raw adrenaline. I desperately wanted to fight him. I wanted to physically remove them both from my property by force. But I quickly calculated the immediate devastating consequences. If I engaged in any physical altercation, Tyson would absolutely call the police. Audrey would eagerly corroborate his false story. They would provide the authorities with a fabricated narrative of a violent, senile man who randomly attacked them. They would use the resulting police report as powerful legal leverage to forcibly remove me from the estate and take everything. I chose the path of tactical survival. I reached deep into my pocket. The heavy brass ring of master keys felt cold and heavy against my skin. I pulled them out and dropped them directly into Tyson's waiting hand. The metal clinked loudly in the tense silence of the room. I did not say a single word to either of them. I gripped the bag containing my wife's precious memories, turned my back on my son, and walked out of the den. I navigated the messy maze of their boxes in the hallway, opened the heavy back door, and stepped out into the cool night air. I walked across the dark lawn toward the detached pool house. I heard the unmistakable, heavy click of the main house deadbolt engaging firmly behind me. Tyson had locked me out. I was officially exiled from the home I had purchased with my own blood and sweat. The sun crested the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the manicured lawn of the estate. Byron buttoned his cardigan against the crisp morning chill and made his customary walk from the pool house toward the main kitchen. His routine was simple and grounded. He wanted a fresh cup of dark roast coffee and a quiet moment to read the morning financial paper. He stepped onto the flagstone patio and approached the heavy glass door leading into the chef's kitchen. He reached out and punched his personal sequence into the digital security keypad. The small LED screen flashed a harsh red light. An aggressive error tone pierced the quiet morning. Byron frowned, assuming his fingers had slipped on the cold keys. He carefully typed the numbers again. The same red light glared back at him. The deadbolt remained firmly locked in place. Before he could try a third time, the sleek intercom speaker mounted directly above the keypad crackled to life. Audrey's voice filtered through the digital feed. Her tone was overly sweet, completely masking the venom underneath. She informed him that he did not need to trouble himself with coming inside the main residence anymore. She confidently stated that she and Tyson had completely reprogrammed the central security system late last night while he was sleeping in the pool house. Audrey explained that the main 10,000 square foot structure was officially being designated as a private family zone. She claimed that Tyson, and the twin boys needed their exclusive space to establish a proper routine without any outside interference. She effectively reduced the man who owned the very ground she stood on to the status of an unwanted trespasser. Byron stared at the small camera lens embedded next to the speaker. He realized they had not just locked him out of his kitchen. They were systematically isolating him on his own property, severing his access to his own food, his own comforts, and his own sanctuary. The sheer audacity of the maneuver was breathtaking, yet Byron kept his facial expression entirely neutral. He did not bang on the glass. He did not shout demands. He simply listened to his daughter-in-law dictate the terms of his imprisonment. The intercom crackled again, bringing Audrey's voice back into the crisp morning air. She added a new, vicious stipulation to her unearned authority. She explicitly commanded Byron to stay far away from the main lawn whenever the twin boys were playing outside. She flatly stated that he was strictly forbidden from interacting with his own grandsons without her direct supervision and expressed approval. She claimed she needed to protect the children from confusing or potentially unstable influences, using his fabricated cognitive decline as a weapon to sever his bloodline. Byron remained perfectly still, his dark eyes locked intensely onto the blinking red light of the security camera. The coldness of her demand triggered a vivid, painful memory from exactly 15 years ago. He remembered standing in the foyer of a rented tuxedo shop holding a modest suit he had purchased with overtime pay from the shipping yard. It was the week of Tyson and Audrey's lavish high society wedding. Audrey had sent a formal typed letter to his small apartment. The letter explicitly stated that his presence would deeply clash with the elevated aesthetic of her wealthy family. She had claimed his permanently calloused hands, stained from decades of grueling manual labor, and his working-class demeanor would humiliate Tyson in front of her elite guests. She banned him from witnessing his only son get married. Tyson had stood by in absolute silence, completely endorsing the rejection. Byron had swallowed his immense pride that day, choosing to step aside rather than ruin his son's supposed happiness. Now standing on his own patio, he saw the exact same pattern repeating itself. Audrey was once again attempting to erase him from the family portrait because he did not fit her narrative of refined privilege. Byron did not raise his voice to argue with the metal speaker. He leaned slightly closer to the camera lens. He calmly stated that he vividly remembered the wedding invitation he never received, and he assured her that he completely understood the boundaries she was attempting to draw. He did not wait for her response. He turned his back to the locked door, buttoned his cardigan, and walked deliberately across the flagstone path toward the pool house. He left her staring at an empty patio through the security monitor. Byron stepped through the sliding glass doors of the pool house and immediately locked them from the inside. The space was compact but efficiently designed, featuring a small kitchenette, a reading area, and a dedicated home office tucked into the corner. He walked directly to the heavy mahogany desk and sat down in his leather chair. He woke his primary desktop computer from sleep mode. Tyson and Audrey had proven themselves to be relentlessly arrogant, but their arrogance bred profound carelessness. They had aggressively changed the physical deadbolts and reprogrammed the surface-level keypads of the main house. However, they entirely failed to comprehend the sophisticated digital infrastructure of the property they were attempting to steal. When Byron purchased the estate, he did not rely on standard off-the-shelf security packages. He had personally contracted a high-level cybersecurity firm to install a localized, heavily encrypted server that operated completely independent of the main house's standard wireless network. This hidden server physically resided inside the walls of the pool house, acting as the absolute master control for the entire estate's digital footprint. Byron typed in his complex multi-tiered administrator password. The screen blinked instantly, granting him unrestricted invisible access to the core operating system of the entire $4 million property. He opened the master security logs, bypassing the superficial barriers Tyson thought were secure. He systematically reviewed the digital footprint of his son's activities over the past 12 hours. He watched the time-stamped logs of Audrey locking him out of the kitchen. He tracked Tyson bypassing the primary alarm systems in the East Wing. Then his eyes locked onto a newly created entry in the estate's automated visitor management portal. Tyson had actively scheduled a high-priority external guest, granting them temporary gate access for later that afternoon. The registered guest was not a friend, a contractor, or a moving company representative. The entry belonged to a senior commercial real estate appraiser, affiliated with one of the most aggressive private lending firms in the state. Byron leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers as the stark reality of their true agenda materialized on the glowing screen. Tyson and Audrey were not simply moving in to comfortably leech off his hard-earned wealth. They were rapidly laying the groundwork to leverage the massive equity of the estate. You do not invite a commercial appraiser to a residential property unless you are planning to secure a massive high-interest collateral loan. They intended to legally bind his sanctuary to a crushing financial debt without his consent. Byron realized they were operating on an incredibly accelerated timeline, indicating a level of utter desperation that made them highly dangerous and unpredictable. He minimized the security log and opened a secure encrypted communication channel to prepare for his next move. The initial skirmish over the locks and the vinyl records was merely a superficial distraction. The real battle was for the absolute control of his legacy, and Byron was perfectly positioned to watch his son walk blindly into his own destruction. The glowing screen of the encrypted security monitor cast a pale blue light across my face in the dim pool house office. I leaned closer to the monitor as a sleek silver sedan pulled smoothly into the circular driveway, parking directly behind Audrey's luxury SUV. A man stepped out dressed in a sharp-tailored charcoal suit and carrying a thick leather portfolio. He did not look like a friend dropping by for a casual morning visit. He moved with the distinct, calculated efficiency of a corporate professional. I tapped the keyboard, isolating the exterior audio feed and boosting the volume. The heavy oak front doors swung open before the man could even reach the top step. Tyson stood in the threshold, projecting an aura of absolute authority and welcoming charm. He extended a firm handshake, enthusiastically welcoming the man into the grand foyer. I tracked their movements as they crossed the imported marble floors, switching the camera feed seamlessly from the entryway to the main living room. The man introduced himself as a senior commercial appraiser. Tyson nodded confidently, immediately stepping into a rehearsed narrative. He swept his arm across the expansive room, claiming the 10,000 square feet as his primary residence. He spoke with the smooth cadence of a seasoned con artist, introducing himself not merely as my son, but as the sole heir and the newly appointed head of the family estate. The appraiser looked around the lavish space, clearly impressed by the towering ceilings and custom architectural details. He casually asked about the original owner of the property. Tyson did not even blink. He directed the appraiser's attention toward the large bay windows overlooking the manicured back lawn and the detached pool house where I currently sat. Tyson lowered his voice into a tone of manufactured tragic sympathy. He explicitly stated that his father was severely incapacitated, bedridden, and currently suffering from advanced irreversible cognitive decline. He claimed I was entirely confined to the guest quarters under constant medical supervision, completely unable to manage my own basic affairs. The appraiser offered a polite nod of condolences, completely buying into the fabricated tragedy. I sat frozen in my leather chair, listening to my own flesh and blood erase my existence with a few casually delivered sentences. The absolute ease with which Tyson lied about my mental state was chilling. He was systematically dehumanizing me to a total stranger right inside my own home. Tyson guided the appraiser into the formal dining room, gesturing for him to take a seat at the long mahogany table. I switched the audio feed to the dining room microphone, listening intently as Tyson poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and began his aggressive sales pitch. He leaned forward, weaving a grandiose, highly detailed tale about his supposed technology startup. He confidently described international expansion plans pending global acquisitions and revolutionary software developments. He painted himself as a brilliant, self-made visionary on the brink of a monumental industry breakthrough. I listened to the polished lies flowing from his mouth, feeling a deep, familiar ache in my chest. I knew the real Tyson. I knew the boy who had arrogantly dropped out of his university business program during his sophomore year because attending early morning lectures required too much discipline. I remembered exactly how he had funded his initial illusion of high society success. He had not earned a single dime. He had financed his expensive suits and luxury car rentals by systematically stealing high-limit credit cards directly from his own mother's purse. It was a shameful, devastating secret Clarice had begged me to handle quietly to protect his future. Now, 15 years later, he was utilizing that exact same deceptive charm on a much grander, far more dangerous scale. Tyson finally dropped the hammer, revealing his true objective. He looked the appraiser dead in the eye and requested a rush, expedited valuation of the entire estate. He explicitly stated he needed to secure a massive, multi-million-dollar commercial collateral loan against the property by the end of the week. He smoothly assured the appraiser that the required liquid capital was a mere formality, a temporary bridge loan needed to finalize a massive corporate merger. He spoke of millions of dollars as if they were pocket change, completely disregarding the fact that the physical property he was casually offering up as collateral represented the culmination of my entire life's grueling labor. Tyson was actively attempting to mortgage my sanctuary to fund his fraudulent existence. He leaned back in his chair, exuding a false sense of absolute financial security, masking the desperate reality that he was a man drowning in his own catastrophic failures. The appraiser pulled a sleek digital tablet from his leather portfolio and set it firmly on the mahogany table. He tapped the screen a few times, his professional demeanor remaining entirely unaffected by Tyson's grandiose posturing. He looked up, his tone shifting into strict corporate compliance. He clearly stated that a commercial loan of this unprecedented magnitude, especially one utilizing a premier residential asset as the primary backing, required absolute, undeniable proof of legal ownership. He informed Tyson that the bank's underwriters would need to physically examine the original property deed and verify the explicit consent of the primary title holder before releasing a single dollar of capital. Tyson did not miss a single beat. He did not stutter or show even a fraction of a second of hesitation. He smoothly leaned across the table, flashing a reassuring, utterly deceptive smile. He confidently claimed that he held a comprehensive, ironclad power of attorney over my entire estate due to my rapidly deteriorating mental condition. He smoothly assured the appraiser that the necessary legal framework was already in motion and promised to produce the fully executed notarized paperwork by Friday morning at the absolute latest. The appraiser nodded slowly, satisfied by the confident reassurance. He agreed to expedite the valuation process based entirely on the explicit promise of those forthcoming legal documents. My blood turned to absolute ice as I sat staring at the security monitor. The sheer magnitude of their criminal intent crashed over me like a tidal wave. I knew exactly what Friday morning meant. Tyson and Audrey had absolutely no intention of asking for my permission. They were meticulously planning to forge my signature on binding legal documents. They intended to legally declare me mentally incompetent, steal the deed to my property, secure millions of dollars in fraudulent loans, and leave me entirely destitute. The stakes had instantly escalated from a hostile family takeover to a severe, premeditated federal crime. They were not just trying to push me out of my house, they were actively plotting to completely erase my legal autonomy and steal the legacy I had bled to build for my grandchildren. I did not hesitate for another second. The time for silent observation had officially ended. I reached across the desk and picked up my encrypted mobile phone. I scrolled past my regular contacts and dialed the private, unlisted number of my attorney, Garrett. He answered on the second ring, his sharp, analytical voice cutting through the heavy silence of the pool house. I did not bother with pleasantries. I swiftly detailed the exact conversation I had just recorded. I explained Tyson's impending forgery plan and the rush appraisal currently taking place inside my dining room. Garrett remained silent for a brief moment, quickly processing the severe legal implications of the fraud. I gave him a direct, unwavering command. I instructed Garrett to immediately prepare the corporate dissolution papers for the overarching trust that technically owned the estate. I told him to draft the precise legal trap that would allow Tyson to step blindly into his own catastrophic destruction. The quiet defense of my sanctuary was over. The silent adjustment had officially moved into its active phase. The postal delivery truck always arrived at the estate precisely at 8 in the morning. I knew this schedule because I spent my first year in this house enjoying my coffee on the front porch, exchanging a polite wave with the carrier. Audrey did not know this routine. She operated on the delayed, lethargic schedule of a woman who believed the world waited for her to wake up. I stood positioned behind the sheer curtain of the pool house window, a dark shadow watching the main driveway. The familiar white delivery truck rolled to a stop next to the heavy stone mailbox at the edge of the property. The carrier dropped a thick stack of envelopes into the brass slot and drove away. I glanced at the main house. The heavy curtains of the master suite remained firmly drawn. Tyson and Audrey were still asleep, exhausted from the sheer effort of their hostile takeover. I unlocked the pool house door and walked quickly across the damp morning grass. I did not take the paved walkway. I minimized the sound of my footsteps. I reached the stone pillar, opened the brass compartment, and pulled out the entire stack of mail. I quickly sifted through the glossy catalogs and local advertisements until my hand stopped on a heavy, oversized envelope. The return address was stamped in stark, authoritative black ink: the Department of the Treasury, the Internal Revenue Service. It was addressed directly to Tyson, marked with a vibrant red stamp demanding immediate attention. I slipped the envelope inside my cardigan and walked swiftly back to the pool house. I locked the door behind me and walked straight to the small kitchenette. I filled the electric kettle with bottled water and pressed the switch. I needed to know exactly what federal crisis my son had brought onto my property. I held the sealed edge of the thick envelope directly over the spout as the water began to boil. A steady stream of hot steam plumed upward, moistening the heavy adhesive. I moved the paper back and forth with deliberate, agonizing patience. I could not risk tearing the paper and alerting them to my interception. After 3 minutes of careful exposure to the intense heat, the glue surrendered. The flap peeled back smoothly, revealing a thick stack of densely printed federal documents. I turned off the kettle and carried the damp envelope to my mahogany desk. The scent of ozone and desperation clung to the paper. I carefully extracted the thick stack of papers and laid them flat against the leather surface of my desk. The bold capitalized letters at the top of the very first page commanded immediate attention. It was a final notice of intent to levy. I adjusted my reading glasses and began to meticulously scan the dense paragraphs of legal and financial ruin. Tyson and Audrey did not just owe back taxes. They were drowning in a staggering, catastrophic deficit. The total outstanding balance, printed in bold black ink, was exactly $2 million. I read through the itemized list of penalties, accumulated interest, and stark warnings of impending asset seizure. The documents painted a crystal-clear picture of absolute financial devastation. Tyson's supposedly revolutionary tech startup was nothing more than a hollow, heavily leveraged fraud. He had clearly spent years siphoning capital, evading federal obligations, and funding a lavish lifestyle on a foundation of complete deceit. The pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped into place. 15 years ago, Tyson and Audrey had banished me from their lives because they genuinely believed they had ascended to a higher social echelon. They viewed my calloused hands and working-class history as a permanent stain on their newly acquired glittering reputation. They had cut me off to maintain the illusion of flawless generational wealth. Now that glittering facade was completely shattered. They had not returned to my life because they suddenly missed the father they had discarded. They had not brought my grandsons to my doorstep out of a sudden desire for familial connection. They had returned because they were completely cornered by the federal government. They were facing imminent federal prison sentences for gross tax evasion and corporate fraud. They looked at my quiet $4 million estate and saw nothing but a massive liquid financial savior. They intended to legally incapacitate me, forge my signature, and borrow millions against my pristine equity solely to satisfy their own criminal debt. My estate was the only thing standing between my son and a federal penitentiary. The sheer arrogance of their plan was sickening. They expected me to unknowingly finance the cover-up of their decade-long criminal enterprise. I pulled my encrypted mobile phone from my pocket and activated the high-resolution camera. I stood directly over the desk, ensuring the lighting was perfect. I systematically photographed every single page of the IRS document. I captured the total amount owed, the specific warning clauses, and the detailed breakdown of their fraudulent corporate filings. I checked the digital images, confirming that every word was perfectly legible. These photographs were no longer just leverage. They were absolute, undeniable proof of a federal motive for the financial crimes Tyson was attempting to commit against my estate. I organized the physical pages back into their original order and carefully slid them back inside the envelope. I applied a thin, precise layer of clear crafting adhesive I kept in my desk drawer to the edge of the flap. I pressed the paper down firmly, running my thumb along the seam until the envelope looked entirely untouched. The steam had slightly warped the paper, but it merely looked as though it had been exposed to the damp morning air. I checked the security monitors. The main house remained quiet. I unlocked the pool house door, walked silently across the patio, and placed the IRS envelope directly on the small wrought iron table sitting on the main porch. It was the exact spot Audrey usually checked for packages. I retreated to the pool house, locked the door, and took my position in front of the security monitors. I did not have to wait long. 20 minutes later, the heavy front door swung open. Audrey stepped out wearing a plush silk robe. She picked up the envelope, glanced at the red federal stamp, and completely froze. I watched her posture stiffen instantly. She turned around and practically sprinted back inside the house, slamming the door behind her. I switched the audio feed to the main living area. 10 minutes passed in tense, suffocating silence. Then the explosion occurred. A violent, screaming argument erupted inside the main house. The muffled sound of Tyson shouting obscenities vibrated through the audio feed. Audrey shrieked back, her voice high-pitched and saturated with absolute panic. The illusion of their perfect unified marriage was disintegrating under the crushing weight of a $2 million reality. I watched the camera feed covering the back patio. The glass doors suddenly flew open with brutal force. Tyson stormed out onto the flagstone patio. His face was a mask of unhinged, feral rage. He held a heavy crystal tumbler in his right hand. He spun around and hurled the glass violently against the stone retaining wall. The crystal shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces, raining down across the patio furniture. Tyson stood there breathing heavily, his chest heaving with aggressive panic. He slowly turned his head and locked his furious gaze directly onto the pool house. He stared at my windows with a look of predatory calculation. The sheer desperation of the IRS levy had stripped away his polished corporate persona completely. I stared back at his image on the monitor. He was no longer just an arrogant son trying to manipulate an old man. He was a cornered, terrified animal facing a federal cage, and that meant he was about to become extraordinarily dangerous. A soft, rhythmic tapping against the reinforced glass of the pool house door broke the heavy silence of the evening. I had spent the past few hours reviewing the digital copies of the federal tax documents mapping out the precise timeline of my son's impending financial collapse. I stood up, smoothed my cardigan, and walked toward the entryway. I peered through the narrow vertical blind to identify my late-night visitor. Audrey stood on the patio. The vicious, screaming woman from earlier this afternoon had completely vanished. In her place stood a remarkably composed actress playing the role of a deeply concerned daughter-in-law. She held a polished silver serving tray balanced in her hands. A covered porcelain plate rested next to iced water and a small medication cup. I unlocked the door and opened it just a few inches, establishing a clear physical boundary. Audrey pushed her way forward, forcing me to step back into the room to avoid contact. She set the heavy silver tray down on the small coffee table with a soft, metallic clink. She turned to face me, her features arranged into a mask of exaggerated, sickeningly sweet sympathy. She spoke in a hushed, gentle tone, completely ignoring the hostility of the past 2 days. She told me she had noticed the lights on in the pool house and felt a profound wave of guilt about our recent misunderstandings. She claimed she had personally prepared a warm meal to ensure I was maintaining my strength. She stepped closer, picking up the small plastic cup and holding it out toward me. A single chalky white pill sat at the bottom. She looked at me with wide, innocent eyes and stated that she was incredibly worried about my elevated stress levels. She explained that she had taken the liberty of calling her private concierge doctor in the city to describe my supposed agitation. According to her, the doctor had graciously prescribed a mild, highly effective sedative to help me achieve a full night of restorative sleep. She extended her hand, urging me to swallow the pill immediately. The sheer velocity of her emotional shift was breathtaking. She was attempting to play the benevolent caregiver while actively handing me an unidentified chemical substance. I stared at the small white pill, calculating the danger she had introduced into my sanctuary. I instantly recognized the vicious, calculated tactic Audrey was attempting to deploy. The sight of the medication resting at the bottom of the plastic cup triggered a sharp, agonizing memory of my late wife. I vividly remembered sitting silently by the edge of a sterile hospital bed during Clarice's final days on Earth. The aggressive oncology treatments had completely ravaged her immune system, but it was the heavy doses of experimental painkillers that had systematically stripped away her brilliant mind. Clarice had fought desperately for every single moment of mental clarity, struggling to recognize my face through the dense fog of pharmaceutical intervention. Audrey had visited the intensive care unit exactly once during that entire harrowing ordeal. She had not offered a single word of comfort or held Clarice's fragile hand. Instead, she had stood near the doorway, tapping her designer heel impatiently against the linoleum floor, loudly complaining to Tyson about the astronomical cost of the prolonged hospital stay. She audaciously suggested that keeping Clarice sedated was pointless and a massive drain on the family inheritance. Audrey lacked any capacity for genuine human empathy, viewing chemical sedation strictly as a tool for administrative convenience and financial preservation. Now she was turning that exact same ruthless methodology directly against me. She did not care about my blood pressure or my quality of sleep. She was preparing the stage for the fraudulent title transfer. Tyson had confidently assured the commercial appraiser that he would legally secure the estate management documents by Friday. They needed me to appear senile, deeply confused, and entirely incapable of resisting their unearned authority. The mysterious pill was not a harmless sleep aid. It was a potent chemical weapon designed to strip away my cognitive defenses. Audrey wanted to forcibly drug me into a state of docile incoherence. She needed me to stagger into the main house tomorrow, slurring my words and disconnected from reality. If I consumed the pill, I would unwittingly provide the exact medical pretext they needed to legally seize control of my entire $4 million property. The sheer malice behind her faux concern was staggering. She was attempting to poison my mind to steal my sanctuary and satisfy a catastrophic federal tax debt. I slowly looked back up from the plastic cup, meeting her unblinking gaze with a look of manufactured gratitude. I needed her to believe the trap was perfectly successful. I reached out with a deliberately trembling hand, allowing my calloused fingers to gently brush against the cold surface of the polished silver tray. I thanked her profusely in a raspy, exceptionally fragile voice, acting completely overwhelmed by her sudden and highly unexpected display of generosity. I grasped the edges of the tray, pulled it securely into my chest, and stepped backward into the shadows of the pool house. Audrey offered me one final, calculating and sickly sweet smile before turning sharply on her expensive designer heel. I watched through the narrow vertical blinds as she practically skipped back across the dark lawn, her posture radiating the arrogant confidence of a predator who believed her prey was entirely secured. The heavy brass deadbolt of the massive main house loudly clicked shut behind her. I immediately carried the heavy tray straight over to the small kitchenette. I did not touch the porcelain plate. I grabbed the tall glass of iced water and poured the contents directly down the stainless steel drain. I picked up the small plastic medication cup containing the chalky white pill. I walked briskly into the attached bathroom, tossed the unidentified chemical weapon directly into the porcelain bowl, and depressed the silver lever. The violent rush of water swallowed the evidence of her malice, flushing the chemical threat deep into the municipal sewer lines. I washed my hands vigorously with hot water, scrubbing away the psychological contamination of her visit. I spent the remainder of the night completely awake, sitting silently in my leather reading chair, mentally preparing for the performance of my life. When the morning sun finally crested the horizon, casting a bright golden light across the estate, I initiated the next phase of the silent adjustment. I intentionally rumpled my thick cardigan, mussed my gray hair, and adopted a hunched, defeated posture. Exactly. At 9 o'clock, the pool house door swung open violently without a single knock. Tyson strode inside, dressed in a sharp navy suit, holding a steaming mug of expensive espresso. He looked at me sitting in the corner, and a broad, predatory smile stretched across his face. I looked up at him, allowing my eyes to drift aimlessly. I intentionally slurred my greeting, letting my words run together in a slow, confused drawl. I rubbed my temples, claiming the room was spinning, and my memories were frighteningly fragmented. Tyson's smile widened into a beam of absolute triumph. He was entirely convinced the heavy sedative was actively ravaging my cognitive functions. He stepped closer, speaking in a slow, loud, and patronizing tone as if addressing a highly medicated toddler. He announced that a professional legal notary was scheduled to arrive at the estate precisely at noon. He smoothly explained that he was finalizing the critical estate management transfer to alleviate my immense administrative burdens. He patted my shoulder with rough, feigned affection, promising me that I would never have to worry about complex financial paperwork ever again. He commanded me to rest quietly until noon, ensuring I remained completely docile for the impending legal maneuver. The trap was perfectly set. He turned and walked out, completely unaware that he had just secured his own catastrophic ruin. At noon, a black sedan rolled up the driveway and parked behind Tyson's vehicle. I watched through the pool house window as a sharply dressed but undeniably sleazy man stepped out. He carried a scuffed leather briefcase and constantly checked his watch. This was the notary Tyson had hired. He did not look like a respectable professional. He looked like someone who asked absolutely no questions as long as the cash payment cleared. 5 minutes later, my door opened. Tyson walked in without knocking. He grabbed my elbow with a firm, punishing grip that betrayed his fake smile. He practically dragged me out of the pool house and across the patio. I kept my head down, intentionally shuffling my feet against the stone pavers to maintain the illusion of a man heavily sedated and losing his grip on reality. Tyson led me through the glass doors and directly into the grand, formal dining room of the main house. The long oak table had been cleared of everything except a thick stack of complex legal documents. Audrey stood at the head of the table. She wore a sharp, predatory grin. She aggressively tapped a manicured fingernail against the bottom of the top page. Tyson pushed me down into a heavy wooden chair. He stood directly over my right shoulder, trapping me in place. The notary stood awkwardly on the opposite side of the table, avoiding my gaze entirely. Audrey slid the documents across the polished oak surface. She placed a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen directly into my trembling hand. I looked down at the dense legal jargon. The paperwork was a comprehensive warranty deed and an irrevocable transfer of property title. It completely stripped ownership of the entire $4 million estate from me and placed it directly into a corporate entity cleverly named Tyson Holdings Incorporated. They were not simply trying to manage my daily affairs or handle my medical bills. They were executing a hostile, permanent takeover of my largest financial asset. Tyson leaned down, his breath hot against my ear. He commanded me to sign the bottom line immediately. He claimed the papers were standard medical proxy forms required by the state to authorize my ongoing health treatments. The sheer volume of lies flowing from my son's mouth was breathtaking. I looked at the notary, but the man stared at his shoes, entirely complicit in the theft. I silently played the part of a confused, heavily medicated old man with absolute perfection. I slowly allowed my chin to drop toward my chest. I blinked rapidly, acting as though the bright overhead chandelier was burning my eyes. I raised my right hand and let it shake violently over the paper. The gold fountain pen rattled loudly against the oak table. I looked up at Audrey with wide, manufactured terror in my eyes. I slurred my words heavily, asking her why there were so many pages just for a simple doctor visit. Audrey let out a harsh, impatient sigh. She slammed her hand flat against the table, ordering me to stop asking stupid questions and just sign where she pointed. I lowered my head and pressed the pen to the paper. I deliberately ruined my own signature. I dragged the ink across the page in a messy, uneven, and jagged scrawl that barely resembled my actual name. I repeated this frantic, sloppy motion on every single page they shoved in front of me. The reality of the situation was a brilliant, impenetrable secret I kept securely locked in my mind. When I sold my logistics company and purchased this massive estate, I explicitly chose never to put the property deed in my personal name. I had spent 40 years dealing with ruthless corporate competitors and aggressive litigation. I knew exactly how to shield my wealth. I had hired Garrett to establish a blind, ironclad corporate trust. I named the corporation Clarice Holdings LLC, forever honoring the woman who built my foundation. The estate belonged entirely to that corporation. The corporation was governed by a strict board of directors, and any transfer of assets required unanimous board approval, embossed corporate seals, and a mandatory waiting period. My personal individual signature carried absolutely zero legal weight regarding the sale or transfer of this property. Tyson and Audrey believed they were stealing a $4 million house from a frail, defenseless old man. In reality, they were aggressively forging signatures on worthless pieces of paper. They were actively committing federal wire fraud by attempting to claim ownership of a corporate asset they had no legal authority to touch. I finished the final page, letting the pen drop from my exhausted fingers. I slumped back in the chair, breathing heavily, completely selling the illusion of a man whose spirit had been utterly broken. Tyson snatched the entire stack of documents off the table the exact second my pen left the final page. He held the paperwork to his chest triumphantly, his eyes gleaming with malicious victory. He gestured aggressively toward the silent notary. The shady man stepped forward quickly, stamping his official seal on every single signature line without asking a single verifying question. He completely ignored his mandatory legal duty to clearly confirm my mental capacity or ensure I actually understood what I was signing. Tyson pulled a thick envelope of cash from his suit jacket and handed it directly to the notary. The man shoved the money into his scuffed briefcase, turned on his heel, and practically ran out the front door. The heavy sound of his sedan speeding down the driveway echoed through the dining room. The moment the front door closed, the atmosphere inside the room shifted violently. The fake patience and manufactured concern vanished instantly from my son's face. Tyson stepped away from me, standing tall and projecting pure, unadulterated ice. He straightened his tie and looked down at me with absolute disgust. He held the forged deed in his hand, tapping it rhythmically against his thigh. He coldly informed me that my usefulness had officially expired. He stated that managing my supposed cognitive decline was far too much of a burden for his busy family. He did not sugarcoat his next words. He told me he had already contacted a low-income state-run nursing facility located 3 towns over. He claimed they specialized in handling uncooperative, delusional elderly patients. He declared that a secure medical transport van was scheduled to arrive at the estate front gates exactly at 6 o'clock on Monday morning. He was not just stealing my house. He was permanently banishing me to a bleak, underfunded institution where I would spend the rest of my life heavily medicated and completely forgotten. Audrey stepped up beside him, a cruel, victorious smile spreading across her face. She looked down at my rumpled cardigan and told me to get out of her sight. She ordered me to return to the pool house and pack a single small bag with my cheapest clothes. She explicitly commanded me not to leave the guest quarters for the rest of the weekend, threatening to lock the exterior gates and call private security if I caused any further disruptions. They had officially set the eviction in stone. They truly believed they had conquered me entirely. They thought they had secured their massive financial collateral and discarded the only witness to their crimes. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear. I slowly pushed myself up from the heavy wooden chair, leaning heavily on the table for manufactured support. I kept my eyes focused on the floor, accepting their brutal banishment with complete silence. I dragged my feet across the marble floor, walking out the back door and heading straight for the pool house. I closed my door, locked the deadbolt, and immediately walked to my encrypted computer. Tyson had just handed me the final necessary piece of evidence. The massive legal trap was now fully loaded and completely ready to execute. The estate was completely silent when the grandfather clock inside the pool house struck 2 in the morning. Byron stood up from his leather chair and slipped a dark wool coat over his shoulders. He opened his door with absolute precision, avoiding the slightest creak of the heavy metal hinges. The main house loomed in the distance like a massive, dark fortress. The master suite windows were completely black. Tyson and Audrey were fast asleep, resting easily on the false assumption that their cruel eviction plan had been perfectly executed. Byron stepped off the concrete patio and navigated the edge of the expansive property, keeping his silhouette completely hidden within the deep shadows cast by the towering oak trees. He deliberately avoided the illuminated circular driveway where his son's luxury SUV sat parked. Instead, he made his way toward the dense hemlock hedges bordering the southern property line. Hidden behind the thick foliage was a rusted iron service gate, a forgotten relic from the original landscaping crew. Byron unlocked the heavy brass padlock, slipped through the narrow opening, and secured the gate quietly behind him. He walked 2 long blocks down the residential street to an unassuming sedan he had intentionally parked there 3 days prior. He started the engine and drove across town, leaving the pristine neighborhood far behind. He navigated toward the industrial district, finally pulling into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a neon-lit 24-hour diner. The bright pink and blue neon tubes buzzed loudly in the damp night air. Byron walked inside the nearly empty establishment. The diner smelled heavily of stale fry grease and strong industrial bleach. Garrett, his longtime corporate attorney, was already sitting in a secluded corner booth nursing a chipped mug of black coffee. Byron slid into the cracked red vinyl seat directly opposite his trusted lawyer. He did not waste a single second with casual pleasantries. He reached inside his inner coat pocket and extracted a thick manila envelope. He slid the heavy package across the sticky Formica table. He informed Garrett that the envelope contained high-resolution printouts of the entire Internal Revenue Service final notice of intent to levy. Byron then reached back into his pocket and placed a small matte black digital audio recorder directly next to the paper evidence. He explained that the device held a crystal-clear recording of the illegal notary session from that afternoon. He detailed how he had taped the hidden microphone beneath his thick cardigan to capture Tyson explicitly commanding him to sign the fraudulent property transfer documents. Garrett carefully opened the manila envelope and spread the stark federal tax documents across the diner table. His sharp eyes meticulously scanned the bold red federal stamps, the severe legal warnings, and the staggering $2 million penalty printed explicitly at the bottom of the final page. He spent several minutes absorbing the absolute financial devastation Tyson had desperately tried to hide. Garrett then picked up the small digital recorder, plugged a single wired earpiece into the side jack, and pressed play. Byron sat in complete silence, watching his attorney's stoic face as the audio of Tyson's aggressive coercion played directly into his ear. Garrett listened to the entire dining room exchange without interrupting. He absorbed the unmistakable sound of Tyson lying about the medical proxy documents, the shady notary stamping the pages without verification, and Tyson coldly condemning his father to a state-run nursing facility. Garrett finally pulled the earpiece out and set the black device down gently on the table. He folded his hands together and leaned forward, his professional demeanor locking into place. He looked Byron directly in the eye and confirmed that the collected evidence was absolutely bulletproof. He stated unequivocally that Tyson had just committed severe premeditated federal wire fraud by intentionally attempting to use an invalid property deed to secure a massive commercial bank loan. Garrett then explained the brilliant reality of the trap they had laid years prior. The aggressive legal maneuver Tyson had executed that afternoon was entirely useless from the very beginning. Tyson had aggressively forced Byron to sign a personal warranty deed transferring individual ownership of the house. However, Byron had never actually held the property deed in his personal name. When Byron quietly sold his highly successful logistics company and purchased the massive estate, he had specifically directed Garrett to establish an impenetrable corporate trust. That overarching trust was legally registered and protected as Clarice Holdings, LLC. The physical estate belonged exclusively to the corporate entity. The corporation was strictly governed by a legally binding board of directors. Garrett stated that absolutely no transfer of physical or liquid assets could legally occur without a unanimous formally recorded vote from the entire board, accompanied by heavily embossed corporate seals. Tyson had aggressively forced a supposedly senile old man to sign a piece of paper that held absolutely zero legal authority in any court of law. Tyson genuinely believed he had successfully stolen a multi-million-dollar asset, but he had actually just handed them undeniable proof of his own desperate criminality. Garrett carefully gathered the high-resolution IRS documents and slid them safely back into the thick manila envelope. He pulled his encrypted mobile phone from his inside suit jacket pocket and placed it squarely in the center of the table. He looked directly at Byron and stated that they currently possessed more than enough actionable evidence to contact the federal authorities right this second. He offered to call a highly trusted contact within the Federal Fraud Division immediately. He forcefully argued that the police could easily arrive at the estate before sunrise, completely surround the perimeter, arrest Tyson and Audrey directly in their beds, and permanently halt the illegal medical transport van scheduled for Monday morning. Byron stared intently at the mobile phone sitting on the scratched formica table, deeply feeling the heavy, immediate temptation to end the suffocating nightmare right then and there. He thought intensely about the deep indignity of being forcibly banished from his own home and the severe looming threat of being permanently locked inside a bleak, state-run facility. However, Byron slowly and deliberately shook his head. He reached across the table and placed his calloused hand firmly over Garrett's phone, physically stopping the attorney from making the necessary call. Byron completely and utterly refused the immediate rescue. He locked eyes with his lawyer and calmly explained the precise logic behind his dangerous strategy. He stated that calling the police tonight would be a massive, unforgivable tactical error. If the authorities arrested Tyson and Audrey right now based solely on a single intercepted IRS letter and a recently forged warranty deed, the couple would immediately play the desperate victims. They would instantly hire expensive defense attorneys and spin a highly elaborate web of corporate lies. They would absolutely claim total ignorance regarding the existence of the corporate trust. They would aggressively argue that they genuinely believed the estate belonged to Byron personally, and that the forced signature was simply a tragic emotional misunderstanding fueled by high stress and a desperate loving desire to properly manage his failing health. They would relentlessly exploit any available legal loophole to minimize the severe criminal charges, drag the litigation out for years, and potentially flee the jurisdiction long before ever facing a jury. Byron was absolutely not interested in giving his deceitful son a convenient manufactured exit strategy. He explicitly instructed Garrett to stand completely down and allow the fraudulent commercial loan application to proceed without any external interference whatsoever. Byron wanted the senior bank executives to formally and officially process the multi-million-dollar request. He desperately wanted the fraudulent collateral to be officially registered and permanently logged within the secure federal banking system. He needed Tyson to fully and completely commit to the massive financial crime. He wanted his son to taste the absolute certainty of his unearned stolen victory. Byron firmly declared that they would wait patiently in the shadows until the commercial bank delivered the preliminary loan approval documents directly into Tyson's greedy hands. They would wait in total silence until Tyson felt completely untouchable, deeply intoxicated by the sheer magnitude of his stolen wealth. Byron wanted to spring the trap on his son at the exact peak of his towering, unearned arrogance. He intended to guarantee that when the federal trap finally snapped shut around them both, there would be absolutely no room for fabricated excuses, no possibility of playing the innocent victim, and absolutely nowhere left to run. Garrett nodded slowly, fully absorbing the sheer ruthlessness of my strategy. He understood that I did not simply want to stop a theft. I wanted to completely dismantle the thieves. He reached across the sticky Formica table and tapped twice on the cracked surface. The sudden rhythmic sound seemed loud in the quiet diner. A man sitting in the booth directly behind us immediately slid out of his seat and joined us at our table. I had assumed the man was just another late-night patron nursing a cup of black coffee. He wore a faded denim jacket and a gray baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. Garrett introduced him simply as Marcus, a private investigator he retained for exceptionally sensitive corporate espionage cases. Marcus did not offer a handshake or a polite greeting. He possessed the quiet, observant intensity of a man who spent his life entirely unnoticed in the background. He slid a thick black leather dossier onto the table, placing it precisely next to my photographs of the federal tax levy. Marcus spoke in a low, gravelly voice, stating that he had been physically and digitally tracking Audrey's exact movements over the past 48 hours. While Tyson was busy strong-arming me into signing fraudulent property deeds and negotiating with commercial bank executives, Audrey was executing a completely separate, highly covert mission. Marcus opened the dossier, revealing a meticulously detailed timeline accompanied by dozens of time-stamped surveillance photographs. The images showed Audrey walking briskly through the downtown financial district. She wore large designer sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat, a pathetic and amateurish attempt at maintaining anonymity. Marcus tracked her entering 3 distinct, highly secure international banking branches. She did not use her regular domestic accounts. She specifically visited institutions known for expediting massive international wire transfers and handling complex foreign currency exchanges. She spent hours inside these heavily guarded glass and steel towers, carrying a heavy leather briefcase that Marcus strongly suspected contained the absolute last of their liquid corporate cash. She was systematically moving physical assets while her husband manufactured paper collateral. The sheer coordination of their criminal enterprise was chilling. They were actively bleeding their failing company dry and preparing the ground for a massive infusion of stolen cash. The investigator detailed how she moved with frantic, calculated precision. She was clearly a woman operating under the severe ticking clock of a massive federal investigation. Marcus turned to the next page of the dossier, revealing copies of highly encrypted financial routing numbers and digital transit logs. He explained the precise destination of the funds Audrey was aggressively moving out of the country. She was not simply hiding cash in a domestic shell company. She was systematically siphoning every remaining dollar they possessed into an untraceable offshore account located deep within the Cayman Islands. The drip-fed reality of Audrey's true nature became glaringly apparent. I remembered her absolute obsession with status and wealth, her constant agonizing complaints about the cost of my late wife's medical care, and her utter disgust for anything that did not directly enrich her own lifestyle. Audrey was entirely transactional. She viewed every human relationship, including her own marriage, as a heavily leveraged investment. Now that the federal government was actively dismantling their corporate fraud, she was liquidating her position. Marcus then slid a crisp printed flight itinerary across the table. The confirmation code was highlighted in bright yellow ink. Audrey had finalized the booking exactly 3 hours ago, completely bypassing her usual luxury travel agent to use an encrypted digital proxy. She had purchased 2 first-class one-way tickets on a red-eye flight departing for a non-extradition European country. The flight was scheduled to leave the tarmac at exactly 11 o'clock this coming Friday night. The entire timeline violently slammed into absolute clarity. Tyson had promised the commercial bank he would deliver the signed property deed and secure the massive collateral loan by Friday morning. They fully intended to receive the multi-million-dollar wire transfer from the bank, immediately route those stolen funds into the Cayman Islands account, and board an international flight before the bank or the federal government even realized a crime had occurred. They were not planning to stay and fight the massive tax evasion charges. They were executing a meticulously planned scorched earth exit strategy. They intended to leave me completely destitute, stripped of my home and crushed under a mountain of fraudulent debt, while they vanished across the ocean with the spoils of a lifetime of grueling labor. The sheer unadulterated evil of their exit strategy was breathtaking. They had used my grief against me, they had weaponized my age, and now they planned to use my stolen legacy to fund an opulent permanent vacation far beyond the reach of American law enforcement. I stared down at the brightly highlighted flight itinerary resting on the diner table. The letters and numbers blurred together for a fraction of a second as my mind aggressively processed the timeline. Then a sudden horrifying realization struck my chest with the brutal force of a physical blow. I snatched the paper off the table, pulling it inches from my face. I read the passenger names printed clearly in black ink. There was a ticket for Tyson. There was a ticket for Audrey. I flipped the page over, frantically searching the remaining text. The back of the itinerary was completely blank. There were only 2 tickets, 2 seats reserved on an international flight out of the country. My breathing hitched violently as the absolute darkest layer of their criminal conspiracy finally revealed itself. They were leaving the country, but they were absolutely not taking my twin grandsons with them. I looked up at Garrett and Marcus, my voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register. I demanded to know exactly where the boys were currently located. Marcus immediately pulled a secondary file from his jacket. He calmly explained that Audrey had finalized an entirely separate arrangement for the children. She had contacted her estranged younger sister, a highly unstable woman with a heavily documented history of severe substance abuse and erratic, dangerous behavior. Audrey had arranged to drop the twins off at her sister's dilapidated apartment on Friday afternoon under the explicit guise of a long weekend getaway. Audrey and Tyson had absolutely no intention of ever returning to retrieve them. They were actively planning to abandon their own flesh and blood to an unfit, unstable guardian while they fled the continent as millionaire fugitives. The sheer magnitude of this betrayal completely eclipsed the theft of my estate. Stealing my house was a massive financial crime. Drugging me into a state of docile incoherence was a severe physical assault. But abandoning 2 innocent, vulnerable children to a life of absolute chaos and neglect was an act of pure, irredeemable evil. The stakes of this silent adjustment instantly shifted from seeking personal justice to executing a desperate, high-stakes rescue mission. I was no longer merely protecting the $4 million sanctuary Clarice and I had built. I was actively fighting for the very lives and futures of my grandsons. If I allowed Tyson and Audrey to board that plane on Friday night, the boys would be permanently lost to a broken, dysfunctional system. The anger burning in my veins instantly crystallized into absolute, unwavering resolve. I looked directly at Garrett, my jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached. I told him the trap had to snap shut with absolute devastating precision. We would allow the bank to approve the fraudulent loan on Friday morning. We would let Tyson and Audrey believe they had achieved total unrestricted victory. But the second those stolen funds hit their account, and the very moment they attempted to step foot inside that international airport terminal, we would utterly destroy them. I was going to tear their criminal empire to the ground, strip them of their freedom, and ensure those boys remained safely inside the only true home they had left. The early morning peace of Thursday was shattered by the arrival of 6 massive commercial catering trucks. I sat in my leather chair watching the security feeds as a small army of event planners swarmed my pristine back lawn. Audrey marched at the forefront of the chaos, clutching a digital tablet and barking orders with the shrill, frantic energy of a dictator. She had commissioned an extravagant, massive charity gala right in my backyard, Workers erected towering white marquees across the manicured grass while lighting technicians strung miles of glittering fairy lights through the branches of my ancient oak trees. A temporary wooden dance floor was laid over the stone patio, and florists carried towering arrangements of imported white orchids into the main house. The sheer scale of the event was a staggering display of financial recklessness. Audrey was actively bleeding their remaining credit limits dry to fund a colossal glittering illusion. She was meticulously constructing a physical manifestation of high society success to dazzle the city's elite. I tapped into the audio feeds and listened to her boast to the lead event coordinator. She loudly proclaimed that the gala was a celebration of their technology company's unprecedented global expansion. She name-dropped local politicians and influential socialites who were expected to attend. But the true venomous purpose of the party was revealed a moment later. She explicitly told the coordinator that a private VIP section needed to be secured near the Rose Garden for a select group of commercial bank executives. Audrey and Tyson were throwing this opulent party solely to seal the fraudulent collateral loan. They intended to wine and dine the bankers, overwhelming them with a manufactured aura of unstoppable corporate success, ensuring the executives eagerly signed the final multi-million-dollar approval documents before the night ended. The audacity of using my home as the staging ground for their ultimate financial crime was sickening. They were transforming my peaceful sanctuary into a chaotic theater of lies, completely confident that their federal tax evasion and impending flight out of the country would remain buried beneath the expensive champagne and imported caviar. I adjusted the angle of the exterior patio camera, zooming in on Audrey as she intercepted the head catering manager near the edge of the pool. She pointed a sharp manicured finger directly at the pool house where I sat. Her voice, captured with perfect clarity by the hidden patio microphone, dripped with absolute venom. She instructed the manager to take a heavy brass padlock from the maintenance shed and secure the exterior latch of my door from the outside. She explicitly commanded him to ensure the lock remained engaged for the entirety of the evening. She claimed that an elderly, severely demented relative was staying in the guest quarters, and she could not risk him wandering into the party and causing an embarrassing public disturbance. The manager nodded hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable with the directive, but Audrey silenced him with a sharp, degrading reprimand about following instructions from the person writing his paycheck. I watched her dismiss the man with a flick of her wrist, treating him as though he were entirely beneath her notice. The way she sneered at the hard-working catering staff instantly unlocked a dark, deeply buried memory. 15 years ago, on the day Tyson first introduced her to our family, she had looked at me with that exact same expression of visceral disgust. I had just returned from a brutal 14-hour shift managing my logistics warehouse, my hands stained with engine grease and my clothes smelling of diesel exhaust. Audrey had refused to shake my hand. She had looked at my working-class attire and made a cruel, highly calculated comment about the unfortunate smell of manual labor polluting the dining room. She possessed a deep-seated, toxic prejudice against anyone she deemed socially or economically inferior. She had spent the last decade and a half punishing me for my humble beginnings, actively working to sever Tyson from his roots because my calloused hands did not fit her narrative of generational wealth. Now, she was locking me inside my own property, treating me with the exact same disdain she reserved for the hired help. I listened to the heavy metallic clink of the brass padlock sliding into place on my door. I was officially a prisoner in my own home, trapped by a woman who believed her synthetic superiority gave her the right to cage another human being. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the estate transformed into a glowing spectacle of manufactured wealth. A string quartet played softly near the illuminated swimming pool, while waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated with trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres. I sat in the darkness of the locked pool house, my eyes fixed securely on the glowing security monitors. At exactly 7 o'clock, well before the main influx of party guests, a sleek black town car pulled smoothly into the circular driveway. A tall man in a tailored gray suit stepped out, carrying a thick, dark leather portfolio. I instantly recognized him from the initial appraisal meeting. He was the senior commercial bank executive. Tyson hurried out the front double doors to greet him, projecting an aura of boundless corporate triumph. He eagerly guided the executive away from the growing crowd, leading him directly toward the secluded seating area inside the Rose Garden. I switched the audio feed, capturing their hushed conspiratorial conversation. The executive opened the leather portfolio and handed Tyson a thick stack of watermarked documents. He smiled warmly, officially congratulating Tyson on the phenomenal success of his technology firm. The executive explicitly confirmed that the internal underwriting department had fully accepted the warranty deed and approved the preliminary terms for the massive $2 million commercial bridge loan. He stated that the liquid funds were currently held in escrow and would be completely cleared for international wire transfer by 9 o'clock the following morning. Tyson took the folder, his hands trembling slightly with adrenaline and unadulterated greed. He clapped the executive on the shoulder, immediately signaling a nearby waiter to bring over a chilled bottle of vintage champagne. Tyson popped the cork with a loud, triumphant crack, pouring 2 glasses and raising his high in the air. He was toasting to his own genius, completely intoxicated by the absolute certainty of his successful fraud. He truly believed he had secured the untraceable offshore funds, finalized his escape route, and permanently buried his catastrophic federal tax debt. I watched him drink the champagne, savoring the image of his towering arrogance. The time for silent observation was officially over. I turned away from the monitor and placed my hands flat on my encrypted computer keyboard. I accessed the hidden master server that controlled the estate's entire security network. I compiled a massive digital file containing every single piece of undeniable evidence I had meticulously gathered over the past week. I attached the high-resolution photographs of the IRS levy, the crisp audio recordings of Tyson forging my medical proxy, the detailed investigator reports of Audrey's offshore Cayman accounts, and the precise flight itineraries proving their imminent attempt to flee the jurisdiction. Finally, I attached the live video feed showing Tyson holding the fraudulent bank approval documents in the Rose Garden. I typed out the direct email address of the senior federal fraud investigator Garrett had provided me earlier that afternoon. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a single ounce of regret. I pressed the enter key with absolute unwavering conviction. The heavy digital package instantly launched through the encrypted server, flying directly into the hands of the federal authorities. The inescapable mechanism of their total destruction was finally in motion. The sky darkened into a deep bruised purple as the first fleet of luxury vehicles began rolling up the long, winding driveway. Valets in crisp black uniforms rushed to open the doors of expensive sports cars and imported sedans, welcoming exactly 50 of the city's most influential elite to the estate. The transformation of my peaceful sanctuary was absolute. A live string quartet positioned near the illuminated swimming pool filled the cool evening air with a sweeping classical symphony. Waiters glided effortlessly across the temporary wooden dance floor, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of the vintage champagne Tyson had purchased with my stolen funds. I sat perfectly still in the shadowed confines of the pool house, watching the dazzling illusion unfold through my security monitors. The guests marveled at the towering white marquees and the thousands of fairy lights draped through the ancient oak trees I had planted with my own hands decades ago. They admired the pristine landscaping, entirely unaware that the man who had actually bled to build this paradise was currently locked inside a small outbuilding just a few yards away. At precisely 8 o'clock, the music softened into a low, elegant hum. Tyson confidently stepped up onto the raised stone patio overlooking the expansive lawn. He held a sleek silver microphone, his posture radiating the absolute unearned arrogance of a conquering king. He tapped the microphone twice, commanding the attention of the wealthy crowd. A hush fell over the garden as 50 pairs of eyes turned upward to admire him. Tyson smiled, flashing his perfectly white teeth under the warm glow of the patio lights. He extended his arms wide, gesturing expansively across the manicured grounds. He welcomed the glittering assembly to his brand-new permanent residence. He spoke with the polished, practiced cadence of a seasoned corporate visionary, smoothly claiming that he had recently purchased this magnificent $4 million estate to provide a better, more secure life for his family. He wove a masterful, deeply deceptive narrative about the explosive success of his technology firm, attributing this monumental real estate acquisition directly to his own relentless hard work and unparalleled business acumen. The crowd murmured in polite approval, completely captivated by the grand, hollow illusion standing before them. Tyson was publicly cementing his stolen victory, soaking in the admiration of the city's highest social echelon. Tyson lowered the microphone slightly, allowing a heavy manufactured sigh to escape his lips. He let his broad shoulders slump just a fraction, expertly shifting his demeanor from a triumphant corporate conqueror to a burdened, deeply compassionate family man. He looked out across the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, his voice dropping into a somber, highly rehearsed register. He told the captivated audience that acquiring this beautiful estate was also driven by a profound, agonizing familial duty. He publicly brought my name into his web of lies, speaking of his father with a sickeningly sweet, fabricated sorrow. Tyson informed the city's elite that my mental faculties had rapidly and tragically declined over the past year. He painted a grim, entirely fictional picture of an old man losing his grip on reality, wandering the halls in a state of severe, irreversible dementia. He placed a hand over his heart, projecting absolute sincerity. He claimed that the sheer emotional toll of watching my mind deteriorate had fundamentally broken him. Then he delivered the ultimate venomous lie. Tyson proudly announced to the silent, sympathetic crowd that he was generously utilizing his vast corporate wealth to provide me with the highest level of specialized medical care available. He stated that he had personally arranged and fully funded my transfer to a premier elite cognitive facility located far away in the serene countryside. He assured his wealthy guests that I would spend my final years surrounded by round-the-clock medical professionals living in absolute comfort, completely subsidized by his filial piety. A collective, audible murmur of profound sympathy rippled through the garden. The guests raised their champagne flutes, breaking into a warm, sustained round of applause to honor my son's incredible sacrifice and boundless generosity. I sat in the darkness of the pool house, listening to the thunderous clapping vibrating through my audio feeds. The sheer magnitude of his public deception was staggering. He was not sending me to a premier medical facility. He had specifically arranged for a bleak, low-income state-run institution to collect me at dawn. He was actively using my fabricated mental decline to launder his reputation and elevate his social standing. He was stealing my home, erasing my legacy, and demanding applause for the execution. The time for hiding in the shadows was entirely over. I pushed myself up from my leather chair, turning away from the glowing security monitors. The federal authorities already possessed the comprehensive digital package containing every ounce of evidence required to dismantle his corporate fraud. It was time to physically shatter the illusion he had so carefully constructed. I walked into the small bedroom and opened the cedar closet. I bypassed the rumpled cardigans and faded trousers Audrey expected me to wear. I reached into the very back and pulled out a pristine charcoal gray tailored suit I had specifically commissioned for my final corporate board meeting years ago. I dressed with slow, methodical precision, fastening the crisp white collar and adjusting the heavy silk tie. I slipped my polished silver cufflinks into place, shedding the fabricated persona of a frail, defeated old man with every button I secured. I checked my reflection in the mirror. I did not look like a dementia patient waiting for a medical transport van. I looked exactly like the man who had built a multi-million-dollar empire from absolute nothing. I walked to the pool house door, inspecting the heavy brass padlock Audrey had ordered the catering manager to secure on the exterior latch. Audrey severely underestimated my intimate knowledge of my own property. When I originally designed this outbuilding, I had the maintenance shed constructed directly adjacent to the pool house, sharing a common internal wall. I simply turned around, walked into the small kitchenette, and unlocked the discreet secondary utility door connecting the two spaces. I stepped into the dark maintenance shed, entirely bypassing the locked front entrance. I exited the shed through the side garden, stepping out into the cool, damp night air. I adjusted my suit jacket, squared my shoulders, and walked purposefully toward the towering white marquees. The live string quartet was playing a soaring, classical crescendo as I stepped onto the edge of the temporary wooden dance floor. I did not sneak around the perimeter. I walked directly through the exact center of the extravagant garden party. The heavy, authoritative sound of my leather shoes against the wood instantly drew the attention of the nearest guests. A prominent local politician turned around, his eyes widening in absolute shock as he recognized the man Tyson had just claimed was locked away in a distant medical facility. The whispers started immediately spreading like a sudden wildfire through the wealthy crowd. The glittering assembly of socialites and executives physically parted before me, stepping back to clear a wide, direct path toward the stone patio. I kept my gaze locked squarely on the raised platform. Tyson was still standing under the warm glow of the patio lights, raising his champagne glass to accept the ongoing applause. He lowered his arm as the crowd beneath him suddenly fell completely silent. The string quartet faltered, the music dying away into a heavy, suffocating quiet. Tyson looked down into the crowd and saw me standing at the edge of the patio, impeccably dressed and projecting absolute, unwavering authority. All the color instantly drained from his face. His jaw went slack. The sleek silver microphone slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the stone patio with a piercing, high-pitched squeal of electronic feedback. The piercing squeal of the dropped microphone echoed off the stone walls of the main house, instantly freezing the murmurs of the wealthy crowd. Audrey recovered her composure a fraction of a second before her husband. She lunged forward, her emerald silk gown rustling aggressively as she crossed the distance between the cocktail bar and the patio edge. She reached out and clamped her manicured fingers tightly around my left bicep. Her fingernails dug fiercely into the fine charcoal wool of my tailored suit, attempting to inflict physical dominance. She leaned in close, her face contorting into a mask of pure, desperate malice. She hissed directly into my ear, her voice a venomous whisper meant only for me. She commanded me to turn around immediately and march silently back to the pool house before she summoned the private security team to drag me away in front of the entire city elite. She threatened to have me permanently institutionalized by midnight if I ruined her flawless charity gala. I did not flinch. I did not break my posture or offer a single inch of retreat. I looked down at her hand, gripping my arm, and then I looked directly into her panicked, furious eyes. The time for acting frail had entirely passed. I drew a deep breath and projected my voice with the booming absolute authority I had utilized for decades to run a massive logistics empire. My words cut sharply through the ambient classical music playing in the background. I announced to Audrey and to the 50 influential guests staring in stunned silence that I absolutely do not take orders from temporary guests residing inside my own home. I ordered her to remove her hand from my jacket immediately. The sheer volume and absolute clarity of my voice shattered the illusion of a demented, confused old man completely. The surrounding socialites and bankers exchanged bewildered glances, their champagne flutes hovering forgotten in the cool night air. Audrey snatched her hand back as if she had been physically burned, stepping away from me in profound shock. She looked at Tyson, her eyes wide with the sudden horrifying realization that their carefully constructed narrative was actively collapsing on their grandest stage. Tyson finally snapped out of his paralyzed stupor. He stepped quickly between Audrey and me, physically blocking my line of sight to the crowd. He plastered a wide, entirely synthetic smile across his pale face and let out a loud, forced chuckle. He turned his back to me and addressed the bewildered assembly of corporate executives and local politicians. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, smoothly attempting to weave my sudden appearance directly into his fabricated tragedy. He spoke with a sickeningly sweet, deeply patronizing tone, loudly proclaiming that his beloved father was unfortunately suffering from a severe, acute senile episode. He shook his head with manufactured sorrow, reminding the wealthy crowd of the tragic, unpredictable mental decline that often ravages the elderly. He claimed that my aggressive outburst was simply a devastating symptom of advanced dementia, a sad confirmation of why I desperately required the specialized medical facility he had so generously funded. He seamlessly continued his performance, addressing the exact same commercial bankers he intended to defraud. He spun a masterful lie about how my mind was permanently trapped in the past, desperately clinging to the grueling days when I built my business from a single delivery truck into a statewide operation. He twisted my lifetime of hard work into a pathetic symptom of a decaying brain, telling the guests that I often hallucinated hostile corporate takeovers. He skillfully used my pristine tailored suit as evidence of my delusions, claiming I often dressed for board meetings that no longer existed. The crowd visibly relaxed their initial shock, transforming back into profound sympathy for the burdened son. A few guests nodded in understanding, completely buying into the narrative of a tragic medical decline. They saw a man bravely handling a deeply embarrassing family crisis with grace and profound filial piety. Tyson glanced back over his shoulder, shooting me a look of absolute, venomous triumph. He truly believed his silver tongue had successfully contained the explosion. He thought he had effortlessly neutralized the threat by weaponizing my age against me in front of the very people he needed to impress. He was convinced his grand illusion was fully intact. Tyson decided to execute the final removal. He turned his attention toward the perimeter of the illuminated patio, catching the eye of two massive, broad-shouldered men dressed in tactical black suits. He snapped his fingers sharply and gestured toward me with a quick flick of his wrist, signaling his private security guards to forcibly remove me from the premises. The two imposing men began marching across the wooden dance floor, their heavy footsteps thudding ominously over the soft classical music. They reached their hands out, fully intending to grab my arms, physically restrain me, and drag me back to the dark confinement of the pool house. Tyson crossed his arms over his chest, his arrogant smile returning in full force as he watched his hired muscle close the distance. He was absolutely certain he had won. Before the security guards could lay a single finger on my tailored suit, a deafening mechanical screech echoed across the expansive property. The heavy wrought iron front gates of the estate, which Audrey had ordered securely locked for the private gala, were violently forced open. The massive metal hinges screamed in protest as the gates swung wide, slamming hard against the stone pillars. The low, aggressive rumble of heavy engines instantly drowned out the string quartet. The musicians stopped playing mid-note. 3 massive, heavily armored black SUVs drove aggressively up the circular driveway, ignoring the designated valet parking entirely. They did not stop at the pavement. The vehicles bumped over the stone curbing and rolled directly onto the pristine, manicured back lawn. Their heavy tires tore deep trenches into the immaculate green grass Audrey had paid a fortune to perfect. The SUVs formed a tight, tactical wedge directly in front of the grand patio, their blindingly bright headlights cutting through the romantic fairy lights and illuminating the shocked faces of the city's elite. The heavy doors of the vehicles swung open in perfect, terrifying synchronization. Several men and women stepped out onto the ruined grass. They were dressed in sharp, dark federal suits, their postures radiating absolute, unquestionable authority. They were immediately flanked by a half-dozen fully uniformed municipal police officers, their hands resting securely on their heavy-duty equipment belts. The officers fanned out rapidly, securing the perimeter of the garden and completely blocking all available exit routes. The entire charity gala plunged into an absolute suffocating silence. The clinking of champagne flutes ceased entirely. The wealthy guests stood frozen in absolute terror, their eyes darting wildly between the armed officers and the men in the dark suits. The grand illusion Tyson and Audrey had sacrificed everything to build was completely shattered by the blinding glare of federal headlights. The men in the dark suits began marching up the stone steps of the patio, moving with the precise, lethal efficiency of a government raid. Tyson uncrossed his arms, the arrogant, victorious smile instantly vanishing from his pale face. He stumbled backward, bumping heavily into the oak table, his eyes wide with sudden catastrophic realization. The ultimate consequence of his boundless greed had officially arrived at his front door. The lead federal investigator did not hesitate for a single moment as he breached the perimeter of the stunned charity gala. He bypassed the terrified security guards and marched directly up the center aisle of the temporary wooden dance floor. The elite guests scrambled backward, pulling their expensive silk gowns and tailored tuxedo jackets out of his path. He was a man utterly unconcerned with the wealth or status radiating from the crowd. He wore a standard-issue dark suit that contrasted sharply with the opulent glamour of the party. He stopped precisely at the base of the stone patio, locking his gaze exclusively on Tyson. The music had died, leaving the estate in a suffocating heavy silence broken only by the low idle of the armored SUVs parked on the ruined lawn. The agent reached into his inner breast pocket and retrieved a heavy leather wallet. He flipped it open with a sharp flick of his wrist, flashing a bright gold shield that caught the glare of the fairy lights. He introduced himself in a loud, resonant voice that carried across the entire garden, stating his official capacity as a senior agent with the Federal Fraud Division. Audrey let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, her hands flying to her mouth, but Tyson remained rooted to his spot. The senior commercial bank executive who had just handed Tyson the preliminary loan approval documents minutes prior instinctively took 3 massive steps backward, physically distancing himself from the center of the patio. The federal agent ignored the banker entirely. Instead, he reached out with his left hand and accepted a clear plastic evidence sleeve from a subordinate officer standing at his shoulder. He held the document up under the warm glow of the patio illumination. It was the exact commercial loan application Tyson had submitted digitally to the bank executives less than an hour ago. The agent's voice was devoid of any emotion, operating with the clinical precision of a surgeon. He demanded that Tyson formally and publicly confirm his identity. Then, tapping a thick index finger directly on the bottom line of the document, the agent asked Tyson to verify his signature. He specifically demanded Tyson confirm that he was actively claiming total legal ownership of the $4 million estate to secure the massive collateral loan. Tyson stood perfectly still for 3 agonizing seconds, his mind visibly racing to calculate his odds of survival. The blinding glare of the federal headlights illuminated the beads of cold sweat forming on his forehead. Yet instead of surrendering, his deeply ingrained arrogance violently hijacked his survival instincts. He puffed out his chest, squaring his shoulders in a desperate manufactured display of dominance. He smoothed the lapels of his designer tuxedo, aggressively attempting to project the untouchable aura of a visionary tech CEO who simply found himself entangled in a trivial bureaucratic misunderstanding. He looked directly down at the federal agent and confidently stated that he was indeed the sole legal owner of the sprawling estate. He raised his chin, declaring in a booming voice that he possessed a fully executed notarized warranty deed to prove his absolute ownership. Tyson then shifted his gaze, glaring directly at me with a look of absolute concentrated menace. He was deploying a psychological tactic he had spent decades perfecting. Growing up, whenever Tyson found himself cornered by the severe consequences of his own reckless behavior, he relied entirely on my desire to maintain family harmony. He remembered how I had quietly paid off his catastrophic college debts to protect his future. He remembered how I had silently covered the massive shortfall in his first failed startup company simply to shield him from public embarrassment. He was banking his entire freedom on the fundamental belief that I was still that same enabling father. He fully expected me to step forward right now, crumble under the intense public scrutiny, and validate his massive lie to the federal authorities to save him from prison. He stared at me with demanding, aggressive intensity, silently ordering me to sacrifice my sanctuary, my financial security, and my dignity to protect his synthetic empire. He genuinely believed that the sheer overwhelming pressure of a public federal inquiry would force the confused, senile old man he had invented to instinctively shield his only son. He waited for me to speak, absolutely certain I would hand over my life to buy his freedom. He assumed my silence over the past few weeks was a symptom of ultimate submission. He fundamentally misunderstood that my silence was actually the quiet, meticulous preparation of his total destruction. The tension on the patio stretched until it felt as though the very air might snap. Before I could even open my mouth to completely shatter his final illusion, the heavy passenger door of the second armored SUV slammed shut with a concussive bang. Garrett stepped out onto the damp, ruined grass. My longtime corporate attorney looked utterly out of place amidst the glittering high society gala, wearing a rumpled trench coat over his standard business attire. However, he moved with the lethal, unyielding confidence of an apex predator closing in for the final kill. He carried a massive, heavily embossed legal binder tucked tightly under his arm. Garrett did not pause to absorb the bewildered stares of the city's elite. He marched directly up the stone steps of the patio, bypassing the federal agents and stepping squarely into the illuminated space between Tyson and the terrified commercial bank executive. Garrett raised the thick legal binder high in the air, ensuring every single person in the garden could clearly see the Clarice Holdings LLC corporate seal stamped aggressively across the leather cover. He announced his presence with a booming, authoritative voice, introducing himself as the sole legal counsel representing the corporate trust that exclusively owned the physical estate. He turned directly to the federal fraud investigator, completely ignoring Tyson's sudden, sharp intake of breath. Garrett stated unequivocally that the warranty deed Tyson was currently using to secure the multi-million-dollar loan was a crude, desperate, and entirely illegal forgery. He declared to the silent crowd that Byron possessed absolutely zero individual authority to sign away the property. He systematically detailed the impenetrable legal structure of the trust, explaining that absolutely no transfer of assets could occur without a unanimous, formally recorded vote from the entire corporate board of directors. Garrett then turned his razor-sharp focus directly onto the senior bank executive standing frozen near the rose bushes. He pointed a steady finger at the man, stating that Tyson had intentionally presented fraudulent documentation to a federally insured institution. He confirmed loud enough for the municipal police officers to hear that Tyson had just attempted to secure a massive commercial loan utilizing completely stolen collateral. The lawyer then looked back at the federal agent, coldly summarizing the situation. By puffing out his chest and proudly confirming his signature on the loan application just moments ago, Tyson had officially and publicly confessed to premeditated multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud. The irrefutable weight of Garrett's legal declaration slammed onto the patio like a falling vault. The last remaining fragments of Tyson's grand illusion evaporated instantly into the cool night air. The arrogant, triumphant posture he had maintained for the past hour completely collapsed. The blood drained from his face with terrifying speed, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. He opened his mouth to speak, to spin one final desperate web of corporate lies, but absolutely no sound came out. His legs swayed unsteadily beneath him, physically buckling under the crushing realization that he had not outsmarted anyone. The trap had not merely sprung, it had aggressively locked its steel jaws around his throat, and there was absolutely nowhere left to run. Audrey let out a shrill, piercing wail, realizing simultaneously that the offshore Cayman accounts they had set up were now completely useless. The red-eye flight they had booked to Europe would depart the tarmac without them. The guests who had applauded Tyson's supposed generosity just minutes ago now stared at him with profound disgust and absolute horror. The federal agents began moving up the remaining stone steps, pulling heavy steel handcuffs from their belts. The blinding flashing lights of the police cruisers reflected in Tyson's terrified, empty eyes. He finally looked at me, no longer demanding my protection, but recognizing the absolute totality of his defeat. The federal investigator kept his stern gaze locked on my son while reaching out his right hand. Garrett stepped forward and slapped the heavy embossed legal binder directly onto the agent's open palm. The sharp smack of leather meeting flesh echoed loudly over the terrified whispers of the crowd. Garrett spoke with absolute, unwavering clarity. He formally identified himself as the managing executor for Clarice Holdings, LLC. He informed the federal agent that the property deed currently sitting in the commercial banker's leather portfolio was an absolute fraudulent fabrication. Tyson's jaw worked silently as he watched his entire financial escape route evaporate into thin air. Garrett opened a secondary file and extracted the authentic corporate formation documents. He presented the heavily notarized pages to the investigator, pointing directly to the legally binding clauses that required a unanimous board vote for any asset transfer. He explicitly stated that Tyson had utilized severe emotional coercion and medical fraud to force an invalid signature from a man who did not personally hold the title to the estate. The senior commercial bank executive let out a sharp gasp of pure panic. He immediately shoved the preliminary loan approval documents back into his briefcase and scrambled further into the crowd, desperately attempting to distance his financial institution from the massive federal wire fraud unraveling before his eyes. Tyson reached out a trembling hand toward the banker, pathetically attempting to salvage the multi-million-dollar bridge loan. He stammered out a series of broken, incoherent excuses, claiming the corporate trust was simply a massive administrative misunderstanding. The federal investigator ignored his pathetic pleading entirely. The agent meticulously scanned Garrett's authentic corporate documents, cross-referencing the thick embossed seals with the crude forgery Tyson had just publicly claimed as his own. The investigator raised his head and informed Tyson that attempting to secure a $2 million commercial loan using stolen corporate collateral constituted a severe Class 1 federal felony. Tyson physically recoiled as the investigator officially confirmed that his fraudulent loan application had already been permanently flagged and locked within the secure federal banking network. The Cayman Islands account was completely empty. The escape funds would absolutely never arrive. Audrey let out a shrill cry from the edge of the patio, desperately demanding that the officers leave her property immediately. Her shrieking fell on entirely deaf ears as the lead federal agent reached back into his dark suit jacket. He withdrew a second, much thicker manila folder stamped heavily with bright red federal warning labels. He held the thick dossier up for the entire garden to see. The agent raised his voice, commanding the absolute attention of the 50 wealthy elites cowering near the swimming pool. He announced that the massive wire fraud regarding the estate was merely the final desperate act of a much larger criminal enterprise. The agent unsealed the folder and produced the high-resolution printouts of the final intent to levy notices I had forwarded to them just hours prior. He formally informed Tyson that the Internal Revenue Service had officially frozen every single domestic corporate account associated with his supposedly revolutionary technology firm. The drip-fed reality of Tyson's business acumen was finally dragged into the unforgiving light. The agent declared to the silent, horrified crowd of investors and politicians that the highly praised tech startup possessed absolutely no proprietary software and zero actual revenue streams. It was nothing more than a meticulously constructed, highly leveraged Ponzi scheme designed exclusively to fund Tyson and Audrey's lavish personal lifestyle. The murmurs among the elite guests instantly transformed into sharp, panicked gasps. Several wealthy attendees realized with crushing certainty that their own massive capital investments were completely gone. The agent stated that the millions of dollars stolen from the local investors had been aggressively funneled into offshore shell companies and reckless luxury purchases. He officially declared the entire $4 million estate an active federal crime scene. He ordered the local municipal police officers to immediately lock down the perimeter and process every single guest for formal witness statements. Audrey collapsed onto a white wrought iron patio chair, her manicured hands tearing at her expensive emerald gown in absolute unadulterated hysteria. Her desperate lifelong obsession with high society status was completely obliterated in a matter of seconds. She was no longer a wealthy visionary hosting an exclusive charity gala. She was the disgraced wife of a confirmed federal criminal trapped and surrounded by the very people she had spent years desperately trying to impress. The absolute finality of the federal declaration snapped the last remaining thread of Tyson's manufactured composure. He looked frantically around the illuminated stone patio. He saw the federal agents pulling their heavy steel handcuffs from their utility belts. He saw the municipal police officers moving methodically to block the circular driveway and the front iron gates. He saw the absolute disgust and pure hatred burning in the eyes of his former investors. The meticulously calculated corporate visionary completely vanished, instantly replaced by a cornered, terrified animal operating on pure, blind adrenaline. Tyson let out a guttural, panicked yell. He spun around wildly, his expensive tuxedo jacket flaring out behind him. He aggressively shoved past a young, terrified waiter carrying a tray of empty champagne flutes. The silver tray clattered loudly against the stone, but Tyson did not look back. He abandoned his wife, abandoned his fabricated dignity, and abandoned any remaining shred of rational thought. He put his head down and sprinted desperately across the temporary wooden dance floor, aiming directly for the dark, heavily wooded southern property line bordering the hemlock hedges. He foolishly believed he could somehow vanish into the suburban darkness and outrun a coordinated federal raid. The lead federal agent did not even raise his voice. He simply nodded sharply to the two uniformed municipal officers flanking the rose garden. The officers moved with explosive, terrifying speed. They sprinted across the manicured lawn, their heavy boots tearing through the soft grass with brutal efficiency. Tyson scrambled off the wooden dance floor and hit the grass, his slick leather dress shoes slipping wildly on the damp turf. He flailed his arms desperately, trying to regain his balance as he bolted toward the shadows. He never even made it past the first line of massive white event marquees. The lead police officer lunged forward, closing the final distance with a massive surge of forward momentum. He wrapped his thick, muscular arms entirely around Tyson's waist in a textbook high-impact tackle. The sheer force of the collision lifted my son completely off his feet. They flew through the air together in a violent tangle of limbs and dark fabric. They crashed with devastating concussive force directly into the primary 30-foot-long catering table positioned at the edge of the lawn. The physical impact was catastrophic. The heavy wooden table buckled and snapped perfectly in half under their combined weight. Hundreds of imported crystal champagne glasses, delicate porcelain appetizer plates, and massive silver serving platters exploded into the air. A deafening, chaotic crash of shattering glass and splintering wood echoed across the entire estate. Expensive vintage wine and gourmet hors d'oeuvres rained down violently over the pristine white event linens. Tyson hit the muddy ground hard, buried instantly beneath a massive avalanche of broken crystal and ruined catering supplies. The elite socialites shrieked in absolute unfiltered horror, scrambling backward to avoid the flying razor-sharp shrapnel. The second officer immediately dropped his knee heavily into the center of Tyson's spine, pinning him ruthlessly to the muddy grass. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Tyson's wrists echoed with absolute finality over the quiet classical music that had somehow continued to play. I stood completely motionless on the patio, watching the flashing red and blue police lights reflect off the thousands of broken glass shards scattered across my lawn. The agonizing, toxic reign of my son was officially over. I watched from the elevated stone patio as Audrey rapidly calculated the precise trajectory of her own survival. The absolute loyalty she had sworn to Tyson vanished faster than the expensive champagne evaporating into the damp soil. She sat frozen in her white wrought iron chair for only a fraction of a second before her deeply ingrained parasitic survival instincts completely overrode her shock. She immediately abandoned the man bleeding in the grass. She stood up abruptly, deliberately allowing the hem of her emerald silk gown to drag through the spilled wine and mud to construct a flawless picture of a terrified, abused spouse. She forced a series of violent, hysterical sobs to tear from her throat, projecting the ultimate image of total victimization. She rushed directly toward the lead federal investigator, throwing her manicured hands up in a frantic gesture of absolute surrender. Her voice hit a perfectly calibrated pitch of desperate panic as she loudly claimed that she was entirely innocent of any wrongdoing. She pointed an accusatory finger directly at her husband, who was currently pinned to the earth by heavily armed municipal police officers. She stated with fabricated terror that Tyson was a ruthless, domineering manipulator who had forced her to comply with his criminal demands under the severe threat of physical and financial violence. She desperately spun an elaborate narrative for the horrified party guests and the impassive federal agents, claiming she knew absolutely nothing about the massive, staggering IRS tax evasion debt currently crushing their corporate accounts. She insisted, tears streaming down her face, that she had absolutely no idea the warranty deed used to secure the commercial bank loan was a crude forgery, or that the Clarice Holdings Trust even existed. She begged the investigator for immediate federal immunity, eagerly offering to testify against Tyson in court and surrender the locations of all his hidden assets. She utilized every single ounce of her high society charm to sell the illusion that she was merely a helpless passenger trapped in his reckless, illegal schemes. Tyson lifted his face from the mud, spitting out grass and the ruined remnants of expensive hors d'oeuvres. The intense physical pain of the brutal police tackle was completely eclipsed by the searing, absolute betrayal of his wife's words. He thrashed violently against the heavy knee of the police officer, pinning him down, his eyes bulging with unadulterated manic rage. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing across the silent, stunned garden, commanding the federal agents to stop listening to her poisonous lies. The polished mask of the untouchable corporate visionary was permanently gone, replaced by a vicious, cornered criminal eager to drag his treacherous partner down into the abyss. Tyson aggressively exposed the absolute darkest corners of their marriage to the surrounding elite guests, roaring that Audrey was the true calculating architect of the entire financial escape plan. He revealed that she was the one who explicitly orchestrated the fraudulent loan application from the very beginning. He detailed how she utilized her deep connections within the downtown financial district to locate a corrupt notary public. When that notary suddenly refused to participate in the final stage of the federal wire fraud, Tyson shouted that Audrey personally stole the stamp and physically forged the government seal on the property transfer documents herself. He screamed that she had spent the last 48 hours aggressively funneling their stolen corporate capital into untraceable Cayman Islands accounts. He pointed out her encrypted digital proxy log, stating she had personally booked the one-way flights to Europe and actively planned the horrifying logistical details of abandoning their twin boys to her severely unstable substance-abusing sister. The perfect, untouchable power couple instantly devolved into a pair of screaming, vicious enemies. They hurled brutal insults and catastrophic legal accusations at each other across the ruined lawn, tearing their own relationship to shreds in a desperate, pathetic attempt to escape federal prison. The 50 wealthy socialites watched in absolute paralyzed horror as the grim, toxic reality of their hosts was forcefully dragged into the unforgiving light. The lead federal investigator stood perfectly still, allowing the chaotic screaming match to echo across the manicured grounds. He listened to their mutual destruction with a cold, entirely impassive expression. He did not attempt to interrupt or silence them until they both ran completely out of breath. The agent then looked directly down at Audrey, a sharp, cynical smile slowly forming on his face. He reached back into his heavy leather briefcase and retrieved a secondary, heavily sealed folder. He calmly informed Audrey that her spectacular weeping performance was completely and utterly useless. He stated that the Federal Cyber Division, working directly in tandem with Marcus's private surveillance, had already intercepted and verified the digital transit logs from the international banking branches. The agent opened the file and held up a thick stack of printed financial manifests for the crowd to witness. He explicitly detailed how Audrey's distinct biometric authorizations and digital signatures were permanently stamped on every single fraudulent offshore transfer document. She was not a captive wife kept in the dark. She was the primary account holder for the Cayman Islands proxy and the principal co-conspirator in the massive wire fraud operation. The investigator informed her that her name was clearly printed on every single falsified corporate tax return filed over the past 5 years. He nodded sharply to a female municipal police officer standing nearby. The officer stepped forward instantly, grabbing Audrey's arms and twisting them forcefully behind her back. The heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly over her expensive diamond bracelets with a loud metallic clack. Audrey completely lost her mind. The sophisticated socialite vanished entirely as the crushing reality of a lengthy federal prison sentence crashed over her. The police officers hauled her and Tyson up from the muddy grass, dragging them forcefully toward the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting cruisers. As she was pulled past the stone patio, Audrey locked her furious wide eyes directly onto mine. She thrashed against the officer's grip, screaming violent, venomous curses into the cool night air. She blamed me for her total destruction. She shrieked that I should have simply died in the hospital and handed over my wealth, cursing my survival and my absolute refusal to remain a silent victim. I stood perfectly straight on the edge of the patio, my hands resting calmly at my sides. I did not flinch, I did not respond, and I did not offer her a single ounce of reaction. I watched with silent, unwavering satisfaction as the police shoved her aggressively into the back seat of the cruiser, slamming the heavy door shut and permanently silencing her toxic voice. The flashing vehicles aggressively reversed off the ruined lawn and sped away down the long, dark driveway, leaving the estate completely cleansed of their presence. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers faded into the distance, completely swallowing the frantic curses of my disgraced daughter-in-law. Their departure broke the paralyzed spell holding the 50 elite guests captive. Total panic instantly swept across the manicured lawn. The city's wealthiest socialites and influential politicians scrambled desperately toward the circular driveway, abandoning their dignity in a frantic stampede. They shoved past one another, demanding their vehicles from the overwhelmed valets. High-performance engines roared to life, tires squealed violently against the asphalt, and within 10 chaotic minutes the grand charity gala was entirely deserted. The extravagant marquee tent stood empty. The string quartet had vanished. The only remaining sound was the gentle sloshing of the swimming pool and the crunch of broken crystal underfoot. I stood alone on the edge of the stone patio, breathing in the cool night air. I surveyed the absolute destruction of Tyson's grand illusion. Standing near the shattered catering table was the head manager and his entire team of servers. They were completely frozen, staring at me in absolute shock. They had just watched the supposedly senile old man shatter a multi-million-dollar federal fraud operation. I walked deliberately down the stone steps and approached the manager. He braced himself, clearly expecting another round of the vicious abuse Audrey had subjected him to all evening. I did not raise my voice. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and withdrew a thick stack of crisp $100 bills I had prepared specifically for this moment. I handed the massive wad of cash directly to the manager, stating clearly that I was paying him and his staff double their contracted nightly rate. I did not want them to clean up the broken glass or the spilled champagne. I had an entirely different task for them. I instructed the entire catering crew to march up the grand staircase to the master suite. They were to take heavy-duty black garbage bags from the kitchen and meticulously pack every single item belonging to Tyson and Audrey. I ordered them to strip the closets of the designer gowns purchased with my stolen funds, to empty the bathroom cabinets, and to drag every last bag down to the curb at the edge of the residential street. The manager looked at the cash, a slow, deeply satisfied smile spreading across his face. He turned to his mistreated staff and gave the order. The workers moved with incredible enthusiastic speed, eager to physically erase the presence of the woman who had degraded them. The catering staff operated with absolute efficiency. Dozens of heavy black garbage bags rapidly piled up on the damp concrete curb, creating a towering monument of discarded greed. I stood by the front double doors, watching the physical remnants of my son's fraudulent empire being unceremoniously dumped onto the street. The estate was finally quiet, reclaimed, and secured. However, the deep silence was suddenly broken by the crunch of gravel. A nondescript state-issued gray sedan pulled into the driveway, bypassing the mountain of garbage bags. A stern woman wearing a practical navy pantsuit stepped out of the vehicle. A bright silver badge clipped to her lapel identified her immediately as a senior investigator for Child Protective Services. The federal authorities had worked with terrifying speed. The moment Tyson and Audrey were formally booked into federal custody, the state was automatically notified regarding the welfare of their minor children. The social worker marched up the front steps, her face locked in an expression of grim bureaucratic determination. She carried a thick clipboard loaded with emergency extraction orders. She informed me that the state was taking immediate temporary custody of my twin grandsons. The government had executed a simultaneous raid on the digital records Audrey left behind. The Cybercrimes Division had completely cracked her encrypted proxy servers. The social worker explicitly referenced the digital evidence, tapping her pen against two highly specific intercepted transit logs named Kich Ban Ong Da Den 2_18.docx and Kichban Ong Daden Mao 1_18.docx. Those exact files contained the horrifying, undeniable proof of Audrey's ultimate exit strategy. The intercepted communications detailed the exact arrangements Audrey had made with her deeply estranged, highly unstable sister. The state possessed undeniable proof that the boys were going to be permanently dumped into a toxic, hazardous environment heavily associated with severe substance abuse. The social worker explained that given the severe flight risk of the parents, the staggering scale of the federal wire fraud, and the documented intent to abandon the minors, the state had no choice but to intervene instantly. She demanded entry into the house to collect the sleeping children, stating they would be placed in an emergency foster facility before sunrise. She was simply doing her job, protecting vulnerable children from the catastrophic fallout of their parents' criminal destruction. But I was absolutely not going to let strangers take my blood away in the middle of the night. I physically blocked the front doorway, stepping squarely into the path of the approaching social worker. I did not raise my voice, but my posture radiated an absolute, unyielding wall of authority. I firmly informed her that she would not be stepping one single foot inside my home, and she would absolutely not be waking my grandsons to drag them into a traumatic, chaotic foster care system. The social worker stiffened her hand, reaching for her radio, preparing to summon police backup to enforce the state removal order. Before she could escalate the situation, Garrett stepped out from the shadows of the foyer. My attorney moved with the same predatory grace he had utilized to dismantle Tyson on the patio. Garrett opened his heavy leather briefcase and withdrew a certified legal binder bearing the official seal of the state family court. He handed the thick stack of documents directly to the social worker. He explained that we had not spent the last week merely securing financial assets and coordinating federal raids. We had anticipated the catastrophic fallout of Tyson and Audrey's arrest. Garrett had stood before a family court judge at 8 o'clock that very morning, presenting the exact same evidence of child endangerment and abandonment. The judge had immediately granted me full permanent emergency custody of the twin boys. The documents in the social worker's hands were ironclad, legally binding, and completely superseded her temporary state extraction order. I looked the social worker directly in the eye, dropping the remnants of my fabricated senility entirely. I presented my verified medical records proving I was in perfect physical and cognitive health. Garrett presented the corporate trust ledgers proving I possessed the massive untethered wealth required to provide the boys with absolute stability, top-tier education, and a completely secure future. I was the sole managing director of a $4 million estate and a perfectly fit, fiercely protective grandfather. The state had absolutely zero legal grounds to remove the children from my care. The social worker meticulously scrutinized the judge's signature, verified the court seals, and cross-referenced the custody decree with her own files. The tension slowly drained from her shoulders. She recognized the undeniable truth staring her in the face. She nodded sharply, handing the binder back to Garrett. She stated that the boys were in excellent hands and walked back to her sedan, leaving my property completely secure. I turned my back on the front door and walked slowly up the grand, curving staircase of the main house. The deep silence of the estate was no longer suffocating. It was peaceful. I opened the door to the boys' bedroom. The soft moonlight filtered through the large windows, illuminating their small forms sleeping soundly in their beds. They were completely insulated from the massive federal raid and the absolute destruction of their parents' toxic empire. I walked over and gently sat on the edge of the mattress. I reached out and took their small, warm hands in mine. The nightmare was officially over. The parasites had been surgically removed. I promised my grandsons in the quiet dark that they were finally safe, completely protected, and forever home. 2 days after the federal raid shattered the toxic facade of my son's life, I stood in the center of the grand foyer and inhaled the scent of lemon oil and fresh pine. The oppressive, sterile atmosphere Audrey had violently imposed upon the estate was systematically being erased. I had hired a specialized, top-tier cleaning crew to scour every single square inch of the main house. They operated with military precision, stripping away the cold, metallic modern art pieces and the imposing, soulless furniture Audrey had used to intimidate guests. I directed the crew to haul those expensive, joyless items directly into the storage facility near the back gates. I was physically and spiritually cleansing my home, washing away the lingering residue of their boundless greed. The massive windows were thrown wide open, allowing the crisp morning breeze to finally sweep through the hallways that had felt like a prison for months. The estate was breathing again. It was finally preparing to become a real sanctuary for my twin grandsons. Once the primary living room was completely cleared of its synthetic modern decor, I walked down the hall to my secure private study. I unlocked the heavy oak cabinet where I had hidden my most precious belongings to protect them from Audrey's destructive purges. I carefully lifted 2 heavy cardboard boxes and carried them back into the sunlit living room. Inside those boxes rested my late wife Clarice's extensive vintage vinyl collection. Audrey had demanded I throw them in the incinerator, calling them worthless clutter. I gently unsealed the flaps and pulled out the worn, familiar cardboard sleeves. I ran my fingers over the edges, feeling a profound surge of warmth replace the cold anger that had sustained me for weeks. I retrieved my vintage record player, wired the heavy brass speakers, and carefully lowered the needle onto Clarice's absolute favorite jazz album. The rich, soulful sound of a saxophone instantly flooded the massive living space, bouncing off the freshly polished hardwood floors and echoing up the grand staircase. The music was a vibrant, undeniable declaration of victory. The warmth, the soul, and the authentic love that Clarice and I had built this house upon were finally restored. I stood in the center of the room, letting the music wash over me, knowing my grandsons were playing safely in the yard outside. The sharp, demanding ring of the landline cut through the smooth jazz melodies, instantly demanding my attention. I walked over to the heavy mahogany side table and stared at the caller ID display. It blinked with the unmistakable automated designation of the Regional County Correctional Facility. Tyson was utilizing his state-mandated phone privileges. I picked up the receiver and held the cold plastic to my ear without speaking a single word. An automated voice prompted me to accept a collect call from an inmate. I pressed the corresponding button, allowing the line to connect. The absolute silence on my end was met with the frantic, hyperventilating sounds of a completely broken man. Tyson did not offer a greeting. He immediately launched into a pathetic, rapid-fire stream of desperate begging. The arrogant, untouchable corporate visionary who had proudly stood on my patio mere days ago was completely gone. In his place was a terrified, weeping child, entirely stripped of his tailored suits and his fabricated power. He sobbed into the receiver, his voice cracking violently as he described the horrifying concrete reality of the federal holding cells. He complained about the freezing temperatures, the terrifying inmates surrounding him, and the agonizing realization that his high-priced defense attorneys were demanding massive upfront retainers he could no longer access. Tyson begged me for salvation. He pleaded with me to liquidate a portion of my corporate trust to post his astronomical bail. He utilized the exact same manipulative tactics he had weaponized against me for decades. He cried out that he was my only son, that he was terrified, and that he desperately needed his father to protect him from the federal prosecutors aggressively building a mountain of wire fraud and tax evasion charges against him. He swore with frantic, tearful promises that he would change, that he would submit to any rehabilitation program I demanded, and that he would spend the rest of his life making amends for his catastrophic mistakes. He desperately tried to reach back into the past, invoking childhood memories and manipulating my paternal instincts, completely convinced that if he just cried hard enough, I would instantly revert to the enabling protector I used to be. He waited for my reassurance, his heavy, panicked breathing echoing through the phone line. I stood perfectly still, allowing the weight of his desperate sobbing to hang in the air. I looked around the sunlit living room, listening to the soft, enduring notes of Clarice's jazz record playing in the background. The contrast between the peace I had reclaimed and the chaotic, self-inflicted hell Tyson was currently trapped in was absolute. I did not raise my voice, I did not yell, and I did not offer him a single shred of emotional comfort. I spoke with the cold, immovable authority of a man who had survived a calculated assassination attempt on his own sanity. I firmly instructed Tyson to stop crying and listen to me very carefully. I told him that I clearly remembered the exact moment he ceased to be my son and transformed into a parasite. I reminded him of the dark, quiet mornings when he would enter the pool house with a glass of water and a handful of heavily sedating, unauthorized psychiatric pills. I vividly recounted how he and Audrey had systematically gaslighted me, intentionally hiding my belongings, isolating me from my friends, and aggressively convincing me that my own mind was violently deteriorating. I told him that I remembered the pure, unadulterated cruelty in his eyes when he laughed at my supposed confusion. My voice dropped an octave, carrying the heavy, lethal weight of undeniable truth. I specifically reminded Tyson about the private medical transport van he had secretly scheduled to arrive the morning after the charity gala. I detailed his exact documented plan to forcibly drag his own father out of his bed, strap him to a gurney, and lock him permanently inside a high-security dementia ward simply to steal a house he did not earn. I told him that a man who actively plans the psychological destruction and permanent incarceration of his own father absolutely forfeits the right to beg for paternal protection. Tyson stammered desperately, trying to interrupt to offer hollow justifications and frantic denials, but I cut him off immediately. I informed him that I had spent my entire life shielding him from the fire, absorbing the cost of his failures so he could walk away completely unburned. I stated clearly that my ultimate failure as a father was protecting him from reality for far too long. That protection had mutated his ambition into pure toxic greed. I told him that the steel bars currently surrounding him were not a mistake or a misunderstanding. They were the direct, inescapable consequences of his own calculated malice. I informed Tyson that I would use every single dollar of my wealth to secure a brilliant, beautiful future for my 2 grandsons, ensuring they would never inherit his devastating lack of morality. I told him that my financial resources were completely and permanently sealed away from him. He would face the federal prosecutors, the massive IRS evasion charges, and the lengthy prison sentence entirely on his own. I promised him that no bailout was coming and that he would finally learn how to survive in the reality he had created. I firmly placed the receiver back onto the cradle, severing the connection with a sharp final click. I turned my back on the phone, walked toward the open windows, and watched my grandsons chasing each other through the bright green grass. Audrey sat in the sterile, windowless consultation room of the Federal Detention Center, her designer silk gown permanently replaced by a stiff, fluorescent orange jumpsuit. The crushing reality of her situation had finally pulverized her high society arrogance. Her offshore accounts were frozen, her luxury assets were seized, and she was forced to rely on an overworked public defender because she possessed absolutely zero access to liquid capital. Audrey immediately attempted to manipulate the legal system with the exact same predatory cunning she had used to terrorize my catering staff. She offered the federal prosecutors a comprehensive plea deal. She eagerly volunteered to turn state's evidence, promising to testify against Tyson and detail every single fraudulent transaction he had executed over the past 5 years. She demanded full federal immunity in exchange for her cooperation. However, her primary condition for the plea deal was retaining full maternal visitation rights with her twin boys. She viewed the children not as human beings to be loved, but as permanent emotional leverage she could weaponize against me from behind bars. The federal prosecutors immediately informed Garrett of her demands. My attorney did not waste a single second. He walked straight into the county family court and filed an emergency injunction for a permanent, impenetrable restraining order against Audrey. Garrett stood before the judge and presented the intercepted digital proxy logs. He laid out the undeniable documented proof that Audrey had intentionally booked a one-way flight to the Cayman Islands. He showed the court her explicit written correspondence detailing her calculated plan to abandon the boys to her severely unstable sister. Garrett successfully argued that a woman willing to discard her children into a hazardous environment to escape federal prosecution possessed absolutely zero maternal rights. The family court judge was profoundly disgusted by the evidence. He signed the permanent restraining order without a moment of hesitation. The legal decree severed Audrey from the boys completely. She was legally barred from requesting visitation, making phone calls, or sending written correspondence to the estate. Her desperate attempt to maintain a shred of control was completely annihilated. She was entirely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a concrete cell with nothing but the devastating consequences of her own boundless greed. The morning after the permanent restraining order was officially filed, I sat behind the heavy oak desk in my private study. The morning sun streamed through the large bay windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the quiet air. Garrett sat across from me, a fresh stack of legal parchment resting on his leather briefcase. It was time to permanently secure the future. I instructed Garrett to retrieve the original last will and testament I had drafted alongside my late wife Clarice over 30 years ago. I stared at the yellowing document, tracing Clarice's elegant signature with my index finger. When we initially built our logistics empire, we genuinely believed that leaving our entire estate to Tyson would provide him with a powerful foundation to build a meaningful, productive life. We fundamentally misunderstood that unearned wealth without instilled morality only breeds entitlement. Our blind, unconditional trust had slowly manufactured a monster who viewed us as nothing more than a perpetual ATM. I picked up a heavy brass letter opener and systematically shredded the outdated document, dropping the pieces directly into the wastebasket. I looked at Garrett and ordered him to construct a completely impenetrable corporate trust exclusively designated for my 2 grandsons. I dictated the terms with absolute uncompromising clarity. The entirety of my liquid capital, the property deeds, and the corporate holdings were to be locked securely inside conservative high-yield municipal bonds. The boys would not receive a single penny until their 30th birthdays. Furthermore, the disbursement of the trust was completely contingent upon incredibly strict behavioral clauses. To access the capital, my grandsons must provide documented proof of 5 years of continuous steady employment. They must maintain a completely flawless criminal record. I was ensuring they would learn the fundamental value of hard work before they ever touched my wealth. There would be absolutely no unearned bailouts and no golden parachutes for reckless behavior. Finally, I instructed Garrett to explicitly name Tyson and Audrey in the exclusionary clauses. I legally barred them from ever contesting the document or accessing a single cent of the fortune I had built. Their names were permanently erased from the Clarice Holdings portfolio. The federal trial moved with the swift, brutal efficiency of a massive industrial machine. Tyson and Audrey's desperate attempts to secure leniency by viciously attacking each other completely backfired. Their aggressive public betrayals provided the federal prosecutors with an overwhelming mountain of corroborating evidence. They essentially prosecuted each other on the stand. The jury required less than 2 hours of deliberation to return guilty verdicts on every single count. The judge showed absolutely zero mercy. He sentenced Tyson and Audrey to decades in federal prison for premeditated wire fraud, massive tax evasion, and corporate conspiracy. They were permanently removed from society, locked away behind heavily fortified concrete walls where their manipulative tactics and synthetic charm held absolutely no currency. I did not attend the sentencing hearing. I had already moved on. I stood on the polished stone of my back patio holding a steaming mug of black coffee. The sun crested the horizon, casting a brilliant, warm golden light across the sprawling estate. The morning air was crisp and completely still. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere that had choked this property for months was entirely gone. The back doors swung open, and my twin grandsons burst out onto the patio. They were dressed in bright, comfortable clothes, clutching a worn leather football between them. They sprinted past me, their laughter ringing out clearly as they hit the damp grass. They tackled each other playfully, rolling across the pristine, manicured lawn without a single care in the world. They were safe. They were thriving. The trauma of their parents' toxic reign had been carefully mitigated and replaced by consistent stability, structure, and genuine affection. I watched them throw the football high into the clear blue sky, feeling a profound sense of peace settle deeply into my chest. The violent invasion of my home felt like a distant, rapidly fading nightmare. I reflected on the grueling journey of the past few months. I had not reclaimed my sanctuary through loud, chaotic screaming matches or physical violence. I had not stooped to the level of the parasites attempting to drain my life. I had won by utilizing extreme patience, calculated intellect, and the sheer immovable weight of undeniable truth. I had allowed their own arrogance to dig their graves, and then I simply pushed the dirt over them. I had executed the perfect silent adjustment. My legacy was no longer a vulnerable target for greedy manipulators. It was an impenetrable fortress, built on a foundation of absolute legal and financial security. The estate was secure, my family was protected, and the memory of my late wife was properly honored. I took a deep, satisfying breath of the morning air, set my coffee mug down on the patio table, and stepped off the stone edge to join my grandsons on the grass. True wealth is never measured by a bank account, but by the integrity of one's character. This story reveals that enabling toxic behavior under the guise of family loyalty destroys both the giver and the receiver. Parents must realize that protecting adult children from the consequences of their actions is not love, but a truly dangerous disservice. Respect must be earned, and healthy boundaries are the ultimate foundation of any lasting relationship. We must always value those who love us for who we are, not what we constantly provide. Please subscribe to our channel and share your honest thoughts below.